There was a young man in ancient Israel so beautiful that people stopped in the streets just to watch him pass. His hair grew thick and heavy, dark as midnight, flowing down his back like a river of silk. Once a year, when the weight became too much to bear, he would cut it. The hair alone weighed 200 shekels by the royal standard, nearly 5 pounds of pure black glory. Women whispered about him in the markets. Men measured themselves against him and found themselves wanting. Children pointed as he rode by in his chariot, pulled by the finest horses in the kingdom, 50 runners clearing his path through Jerusalem's narrow streets. His name was Absalom, and he was the third son of King David, ruler of all Israel. But more than just beautiful, Absalom possessed something far more dangerous. He had charm that could melt the hardest heart, intelligence that could untangle the most complex problem, and ambition that burned hotter than the sun over Judean hills. Yet beneath all that beauty, beneath the smile that won every room he entered, something dark was growing. A wound that would never heal, a grudge that would fester for years, a hunger for justice that would twist into something else entirely. Something that would bring a kingdom to its knees and break a father's heart in ways no enemy ever could. This is the story of the most dangerous kind of betrayal. Not the sudden strike of an enemy, but the slow turning of a beloved son against the father who gave him life. It is a tale written in the oldest book, preserved for thousands of years because it speaks to something timeless in the human heart. The tragedy of love that enables destruction, the cost of beauty without wisdom, the price paid when pain is never truly addressed. Before we open today's scroll, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep these in-depth stories of faith, history, and mystery alive. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. This channel has become a global fellowship of seekers, historians, believers, and thinkers united by curiosity. Now take a deep breath and step with me into the pages of time. Jerusalem in those days stood at the peak of its glory. David had conquered every enemy. The Philistines, who once humiliated Israel, now paid tribute. The Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, all bowed before the shepherd boy who had become the greatest warrior king the nation ever knew. Gold flowed into the city from a dozen conquered lands. Merchants from Egypt and Damascus crowded the markets. Builders raised houses of hewn stone where once stood only mud brick hovels. The palace itself sprawled across the highest point of the city, a complex of buildings that grew with each passing year. Cedar from Lebanon lined the walls, filling the air with its sweet scent. Tapestries from distant lands hung in every room. Musicians played in the courtyards. Scribes recorded the daily business of an expanding empire. This was not the rough camp of Saul's failing kingdom, but a true royal court that commanded respect across the known world. At the center of this power sat David himself, now in his middle years. The young shepherd who killed Goliath had become a complex man, beloved by his people, but carrying the weight of many sins. The blood of Uriah the Hittite stained his hands, though God had forgiven the crime. The wife he had stolen, Bathsheba, now held a favored place in his household. The prophet Nathan had declared judgment, yet David's throne seemed secure. Israel had never known such prosperity, such peace, such promise. But palaces hide secrets that humble homes cannot contain. And David's household was not one family, but many families woven together by politics, passion, and the dangerous practice of taking multiple wives. In the ancient world, kings measured their power partly by the number of women in their harems. Each wife represented an alliance, a treaty, a bond with another tribe or nation. David had married strategically as he climbed to power, adding wife after wife until his household resembled a small nation unto itself. Michal, Saul's daughter, had been his first royal connection, though that marriage had long since soured. Ahinoam of Jezreel bore him Amnon, his firstborn. Abigail, the wise woman who had once saved David from bloodshed, gave him Chileab. Maacah, daughter of the king of Geshur, brought political alliance with that Aramean kingdom and gave birth to Absalom. There were others, Haggith, who bore Adonijah, Abital, Eglah. And those were just the wives, the text names. A king's household in those days included concubines as well, women of secondary status who nonetheless bore children and competed for favor. Each woman wanted her son to rise. Each child grew up knowing they were royal but uncertain of their place in the succession. Each half-brother and half-sister navigated a dangerous world where family ties mixed with political calculation in poisonous ways. Into this environment, Absalom grew from child to man. His mother Maacah came from foreign royalty, and perhaps she whispered to him about the throne that might one day be his. His older half-brother Amnon stood ahead of him in the line of succession. But Chileab, the second son, is never mentioned again after his birth. Perhaps he died young. Perhaps he was unsuited for kingship. Either way, only Amnon stood between Absalom and the crown in practical terms. From his earliest years, Absalom learned the arts that princes must know. He trained with sword and spear in the palace courts, his natural grace making him excel in combat arts. He studied the records of Israel's judges and kings, learning the history of his people. He watched his father conduct business at the city gates, settling disputes and rendering judgment. He saw how David balanced mercy with justice, how the king could be fierce in battle yet soft-hearted with his children. Perhaps too soft-hearted. That would prove part of the tragedy to come. Absalom also had a sister, Tamar, born to the same mother, Maacah. The text tells us she was beautiful, but it describes her beauty differently than Absalom's. Where his beauty was public spectacle, hers was the kind that endangered her in a household full of men who believed women existed for their pleasure. She was probably younger than Absalom, growing up under his protective eye. The bond between them was strong, strengthened perhaps by their shared foreign mother in a court dominated by Israelite women. By the time our story truly begins, Absalom has reached young manhood. He stands perhaps 20 years old, maybe a few years more, old enough to have proven himself in small military campaigns, old enough to have married and begun his own family. He has 3 sons whose names the text does not bother to record, and 1 daughter whom he names Tamar after his beloved sister. Old enough to have developed a reputation not just for beauty but for capability. When Absalom speaks, people listen. When he makes a suggestion, even the king's counselors take note, but he is not heir to the throne. That position belongs to Amnon, his half-brother, son of Ahinoam. And between these 2 princes, the oldest and the 3rd son, flows an undercurrent of tension that everyone in the palace can feel, but no one directly addresses. Amnon carries the weight of being firstborn, but perhaps lacks the charisma that makes men want to follow. Absalom shines brighter in every public space, but knows the law gives precedence to birth order, not worthiness. The city spreads below the palace, thousands of souls going about their daily lives. Farmers bringing produce to market, craftsmen hammering at their trades, priests performing their duties at the tent that housed the Ark of the Covenant. For the great temple has not yet been built, children playing in the dusty streets, mothers drawing water from the ancient wells, merchants arguing over prices, scribes teaching students to read and write, a living, breathing city at peace, unaware that within the palace walls forces are gathering that will soon tear everything apart. Absalom stands at a palace window looking out over his father's kingdom. The evening sun turns Jerusalem's stones golden. Smoke from cooking fires rises from 1,000 households. In the distance, the Judean wilderness stretches toward the Salt Sea, and beyond that, enemy nations held in check by David's power. The young prince's hand rests on the window frame, his rings catching the light. His hair, freshly oiled and perfumed, moves slightly in the breeze. What goes through his mind in this moment? Does he dream of the throne? Does he measure himself against Amnon and find his half-brother lacking? Does he calculate his chances, count his supporters, plan his future? Or does he simply enjoy the beauty of the evening, content to be a prince in his father's house, secure in his place even if it is not the first place? We cannot know his thoughts, but we can know what happens next. And what happens next will change everything, not just for Absalom, but for the entire nation. A crime is about to be committed within the royal household, a violation so terrible that it will demand a response. And that response, when it finally comes, will set in motion a chain of events that leads to civil war. Father fighting son, brother against brother, and one of the most heartbreaking cries ever recorded in human literature. The sun sets over Jerusalem, night falls on the palace, and in that darkness evil stirs. Not the evil of foreign enemies or invading armies, but the evil that grows within families when sin is tolerated, when justice is delayed, when a father's love becomes paralysis in the face of necessary judgment. Absalom does not know it yet, but his life is about to change. The beautiful prince, admired by all, is about to become something else. First a victim's advocate, then an avenger, then a rebel, then a corpse hanging between heaven and earth, caught in a place where he does not belong, neither son nor king, neither alive nor fully dead until the final blow falls. But that moment is still years away. Right now he is simply Absalom, beautiful Absalom, third son of David, a young man who seems to have everything except the one thing he will come to want more than life itself. The palace of David was not one household, but many households forced to live under a single roof. Each wife maintained her own apartments, her own servants, her own small court within the larger court. Each raised her children to understand they were royal, that they carried the blood of the anointed king, that greatness was their birthright. But each also taught them in whispered conversations behind closed doors that they must fight for their place, that nothing would be handed to them simply because their father was king. This was the bitter fruit of polygamy, a practice common among ancient kings but poisonous nonetheless. What seemed like strength, binding alliances through marriage, binding tribes to the throne through family connection, actually created weakness. It bred competition where there should have been unity. It turned brothers into rivals. It made the royal household a battlefield where the weapons were influence, favor, and whispered plots. Consider the mathematics of dysfunction. David had at least 8 wives whose names we know, and likely more whose names vanished from history. Each bore children. Each child grew up acutely aware of their standing in the hierarchy. The sons of the chief wife might look down on sons of lesser wives. The sons born in Hebron before David became king of all Israel might feel their claim was stronger than those born later in Jerusalem. The sons whose mothers came from powerful families might leverage those connections. It was a system designed to create exactly the kind of tragedy that was about to unfold. Amnon stood at the top of this dangerous ladder. As David's firstborn son, born to Ahinoam of Jezreel during the years David fled from Saul, he carried the presumption of succession. In a stable kingdom, he would have spent his youth preparing to rule, learning statecraft from his father, building relationships with the tribal elders, proving himself in battle and judgment. But Amnon seems to have been a man of appetites rather than discipline. The glimpse we get of him in the text reveals someone who confused desire with love, who took what he wanted without counting the cost, who had the position of crown prince but perhaps not the character it required. He was old enough now to have his own household, his own friends, his own schemes. Among his companions was his cousin Jonadab, son of David's brother Shemaiah. The text calls Jonadab a very subtle man, which in ancient Hebrew carries darker implications than mere cleverness. He was crafty, cunning, the kind of friend who enables the worst in others while pretending to help. Every dysfunctional court has such figures whispering in the ears of the powerful, turning vague thoughts into concrete plans, providing justification for what should never be justified. Then there was Tamar, daughter of Maacah, sister to Absalom. She lived in that strange, vulnerable space occupied by royal women in the ancient world. Valuable as a potential marriage alliance, protected in theory by her status, yet ultimately powerless in a world where men made all decisions. She would have been raised in the women's quarters of the palace, learning the arts considered proper for a princess. How to weave, how to prepare special dishes, how to manage a household. Perhaps she was educated beyond what was common for women of that era, given David's love of music and poetry. Perhaps she played the harp, sang the psalms her father composed, read the ancient stories of her people. The text emphasizes her beauty, and in the ancient world, beauty for a woman could be either blessing or curse, often both. She would have been carefully guarded, her virginity protected because it represented political value. When the time came, she would be married to seal some alliance, to bind some tribal leader closer to the throne, to extend David's power through the bonds of family. That was the expected path for a princess in those days. Not to choose her own destiny, but to fulfill the destiny others chose for her. But she was also Absalom's sister, and that bond appears to have been strong, perhaps because they shared the same mother in a household of many mothers. Perhaps because Maacah, daughter of a foreign king, taught her children to stand together against the others. Perhaps simply because Absalom's protective nature and Tamar's gentle spirit created a genuine affection between them. Whatever the reason, the text makes clear that Absalom loved his sister, and she trusted him. The palace itself reflected the dysfunction within it. Built in stages as David's power grew, it lacked the unified design of structures planned from the beginning. New wings attached to old sections. Courtyards led to other courtyards in confusing patterns. Some apartments opened directly onto public spaces while others hid in corners. The layout meant that people could encounter each other unexpectedly, that privacy was difficult to maintain, that what should have been kept separate often collided. In the women's quarters, tensions simmered constantly. The wives competed for David's attention, for favor, for their son's advancement. Every slight was remembered. Every preference the king showed was analyzed. When David spent more time with one wife, others plotted to regain his notice. When he praised one son, other mothers schemed to elevate their own children. This was not a home in any meaningful sense. It was a collection of rival camps bound together by the will of one man. And when that will faltered or his attention wandered, the bonds loosened dangerously. David himself moved through this minefield with a combination of affection and avoidance. He loved his children, that much is clear from the text. He delighted in them, perhaps spoiled them, certainly found it difficult to discipline them properly. But he also seems to have been blind to the dangers inherent in his household structure. Or perhaps he simply did not know how to address them. He had built an empire through strength and decisiveness, but within his own home he appeared unable or unwilling to impose the order that was desperately needed. The wider household included not just wives and children, but concubines, servants, guards, counselors, priests, scribes, musicians, and all the complex machinery of a royal court. Some of these people had been with David since his outlaw days, loyal followers who had shared his hardships and now enjoyed his triumph. Others had attached themselves to his rising star more recently, calculating that service to the king would advance their own fortunes. Still others served from duty or tradition, Levites and priests fulfilling their appointed roles. Among David's counselors, none was more valued than Ahithophel the Gilonite. This man's wisdom was legendary. When Ahithophel spoke, it was said to be as if one had inquired of the oracle of God. David trusted his judgment on matters both political and personal. What David did not know, what perhaps no one knew yet, was that Ahithophel had his own connections to the brewing tragedy. His granddaughter was Bathsheba, the woman David had taken for himself after arranging her husband's death. That old wound, forgiven by God perhaps, but never forgotten by those who loved Uriah, would fester in ways David could not imagine. The priesthood, too, had divided loyalties. Abiathar served as high priest, descended from the line of Eli, loyal to David through years of exile. But there were other priests, other Levites, each with their own family connections, their own interests. In a time of crisis, which way would they turn? Toward the anointed king or toward a charismatic prince who promised change? David's military structure reflected similar complexity. Joab served as commander of the army, David's nephew. Ruthless and effective, loyal to David, but also independent in ways that sometimes troubled the king. Joab had killed Abner against David's wishes. He would later kill Amasa the same way. He was the kind of man who did what he thought necessary regardless of orders, and David seemed unable to rein him in. Beneath Joab served the mighty men, David's elite warriors, each famous for their exploits, each bound to the king by bloodshed in battle. But even among these, loyalties would be tested when the crisis came. This then was the house David had built, glorious from the outside, magnificent in its trappings, powerful in its reach across the land. But internally fractured, held together more by David's personal authority than by any stable structure. A house where too many people wanted too many things, where ambition mixed with resentment, where old sins cast long shadows, where justice was uncertain and discipline was weak. It was the kind of house where a crime could happen, where evil could grow, where the unthinkable could become real. And once that crime occurred, once that evil emerged into the light, the structure would prove unable to contain the consequences. The careful political marriages would become weapons. The many sons would become enemies. The house built on blood and desire would begin to devour itself. Evening falls again over Jerusalem. In the marketplace, merchants pack their goods. At the gates, elders finish hearing the day's disputes. In the temple courts, priests prepare the evening sacrifice. Throughout the city, families gather for their meals. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that in the palace above them, in the heart of power, something monstrous is taking shape. Amnon lies on his bed, troubled by thoughts he should not entertain. Jonadab sits nearby, watching, calculating. Tamar goes about her duties in the women's quarters, innocent of what is being planned. Absalom attends to matters of state, representing his father in some official capacity, competent and respected. David sits in judgment or reviews military reports or composes another psalm, his attention on the large matters of kingdom while the small matters, the family matters, drift toward catastrophe. The stage is set, the players are in position, and tomorrow or the next day or soon the wound will be inflicted that can never be healed, that will set brother against brother, that will plant the seed of rebellion that will grow until it chokes the very kingdom David built. The crime began with what Amnon called love, but what was actually obsession twisted into something far darker. He looked at Tamar, his half-sister, and wanted her. The text tells us he loved her, but ancient Hebrew uses the same word for love that can mean desire, lust, or obsession. Whatever burned in Amnon's heart, it consumed him. He grew thin with wanting. He lost his appetite. His face showed the signs of inner torment, and his friend Jonadab noticed. "Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner day by day?" Jonadab asked. "Will you not tell me?" And Amnon, perhaps relieved to speak the thoughts that had been eating him alive, confessed, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Notice how he identified her. Not as his own sister, which she was by blood through their shared father, but as Absalom's sister. Even in his confession, Amnon framed his desire in terms of taking something that belonged to his rival. For surely Amnon saw Absalom as a rival, the younger brother whose brilliance made the crown prince seem dull by comparison, whose beauty made Amnon seem ordinary, whose charisma drew people the way Amnon's birthright never could. Jonadab, that subtle, cunning friend, did not counsel Amnon to master his desires. He did not remind him that such a union was forbidden, that Tamar was family, that this path led only to destruction. Instead, he offered a plan. "Pretend to be sick," he said. "When your father comes to see you, ask him to send Tamar to prepare food in your sight so that you might eat from her hand." It was a simple trap, elegant in its exploitation of David's fatherly love and Tamar's dutiful obedience. And it worked exactly as Jonadab predicted. Amnon lay down and pretended illness. David came to check on his firstborn son, concerned as any father would be. And Amnon made his request, framing it as the wish of a sick man for comfort food prepared by gentle hands. "Let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." David suspected nothing. Why would he? This was his son, his daughter, his household. He sent word to Tamar, "Go now to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." Tamar went. Of course she went. A princess did not disobey the king's direct command, and this seemed innocent enough. Her half-brother was ill. She would prepare food to restore his strength. It was an act of family kindness, nothing more. She probably took her servants with her as propriety demanded. She probably thought about what special dish might tempt a sick man's appetite. The text gives us details that make the scene vivid. She took dough and kneaded it, making cakes in Amnon's sight just as he had requested. She baked them. The smell of fresh bread filled the room. She brought the pan to serve him, but Amnon refused to eat. Instead, he ordered everyone else out of the room. Every servant, every attendant, everyone who might witness what he was about to do. And Tamar, though she must have felt the first stirrings of fear, still did not understand. Not until Amnon's hand closed on her arm. Not until he pulled her toward his bed. Not until his true intention became horrifyingly clear. "Bring the food into the bedroom," he said, his voice no longer weak with illness, "so I may eat from your hand." She brought it, perhaps still hoping this was somehow innocent, that she misread his intent. But when she came near, he took hold of her. "No, my brother," she cried out. "Do not force me, for no such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing." Her words reveal her intelligence even in terror. She appealed to him on multiple grounds. She called him brother, reminding him of their bond. She invoked the law, the standards of their people. She warned him of the consequences, thinking of her own shame, but also his. "Where could I take my shame?" she asked. "And as for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel." Then she offered an alternative, grasping at any possibility that might stop what was happening. "Speak to the king," she said, "for he will not withhold me from you." Was this true? Would David actually allow such a marriage? The law of Moses forbade marriage between half-siblings who shared the same father, but perhaps Tamar, desperate, thought David might make an exception. Or perhaps she simply said anything that might delay the inevitable, hoping someone would come, that rescue would arrive, that this nightmare would somehow end. But Amnon would not listen. He was stronger than she was, and he forced her. The text uses stark, brutal language. He violated her. He took what was not his to take. He destroyed her honor, her future, her very sense of self in a world where a woman's virginity determined her worth. And then, In a twist that makes the crime even more devastating, something shifted in Amnon's heart. The text tells us that the hatred with which he hated her after the act was greater than the love with which he had loved her before. What he had called love revealed itself as mere lust, and once satisfied, it turned immediately to revulsion. He looked at the woman he had just violated and felt not guilt or remorse, but anger that she existed, that she reminded him of what he had done. "Get up and go," he said, his voice now cold. But Tamar, even in her devastation, understood that sending her away like this would compound the crime. "No," she said, "because this wrong in sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me." She was right. By Israelite law, if a man violated a virgin, he was required to marry her and provide for her the rest of her life. It was not a good law, not from our modern perspective, but it at least ensured the woman would not be cast out destitute. By refusing to marry her, by sending her away, Amnon marked her as damaged goods, unmarriageable, without future or hope. But Amnon did not care about law or honor anymore. He called his servant. "Put this woman out, away from me," he commanded, "and bolt the door after her." So they put her out, this princess, this victim. She was wearing a long robe with sleeves, the special garment worn by virgin daughters of the king. As she left Amnon's house, she tore that robe. She put ashes on her head, the sign of mourning and devastation. She laid her hand on her head in the gesture of overwhelming grief. And she went away, crying aloud, her sobs echoing through the palace courts. Absalom found her, his beloved sister torn and weeping, ashes in her hair, her special robe in tatters. He knew immediately what had happened. The text suggests he may have suspected Amnon's intentions, may have been on his way to check on her when he encountered her fleeing the scene. "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" he asked, his voice tight with rage, barely controlled. "But hold your peace now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." These words have puzzled readers for centuries. Was Absalom telling her to remain silent? Was he minimizing the crime? Or was he speaking the hard truth of their situation, that going public would only add public shame to private devastation? That in their world such things were often buried rather than brought to light. But the text adds one crucial detail. Absalom hated Amnon, and that hatred would not fade with time. It would not diminish or be forgotten. It would grow, feeding on itself, becoming the organizing principle of Absalom's life. Tamar went to live in Absalom's house. The text tells us she remained there, desolate, a broken thing in a broken world. The Hebrew word suggests she lived as a widow might, in mourning for the life that had been stolen from her. No marriage prospects now, no children of her own, just empty years in her brother's household. A living reminder of injustice unaddressed. And David heard about all these things. He was very angry. His rage burned hot, the text says. But he did nothing. Nothing. He did not punish Amnon. He did not even confront him directly. He simply let it stand, this monstrous crime committed by his firstborn son against his daughter. Why? Later texts suggest that David's love for Amnon paralyzed him. Or perhaps his own guilt over Bathsheba made him feel hypocritical, judging sexual sin in his son. Or perhaps he thought time would heal the wound, that the family would move past this horror if he simply did not make it worse by taking official action. Whatever his reasoning, his inaction would prove catastrophic. Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad. For 2 full years he maintained this silence. He did not shout or threaten. He did not challenge Amnon publicly. He played the part of dutiful prince, attending court functions, managing his estates, seeming to all the world as if nothing had changed. But in that silence, something terrible was brewing. 2 years is a long time to nurse hatred, long enough for hot rage to cool into something far more dangerous. long enough to plan carefully, long enough to recruit allies and arrange circumstances, long enough for Absalom's naturally strategic mind to craft not just revenge, but perfect revenge. He would have spent those 2 years studying Amnon, learning his patterns, understanding his weaknesses. He would have noted which servants were loyal to his half-brother and which might be turned. He would have observed court dynamics, seeing who would stand with Amnon if conflict came and who might look the other way. He would have calculated the political cost of various actions, weighing his own position, considering his father's likely response. And through it all, he would have looked at his sister and his household, desolate, and felt his hatred grow stronger each day. This is how rage becomes deadly. Not the explosion that spends itself quickly, but the cold fury that plans and waits. Absalom did not want to merely hurt Amnon. He wanted to destroy him in a way that could not be undone, and he wanted it to look like something other than what it was. 2 years of silence ended at sheep shearing time. In the agricultural rhythm of ancient Israel, the shearing of sheep marked more than just a practical necessity. It was a time of celebration, of feasting, a moment when shepherds and landowners gathered to mark the completion of another season's work. The wool represented wealth, the product of months of careful tending. Custom demanded that the owner of the flocks host a feast for those who had worked the sheep and often for family and friends as well. It was a time when wine flowed freely, when guards might lower their vigilance, when celebration provided cover for other activities. Absalom owned sheep, and his flocks grazed in the hill country near Baal Hazor, which is beside Ephraim. This was his own estate, his own land, far enough from Jerusalem that what happened there might unfold without immediate royal intervention. He planned a shearing festival, and as custom demanded, he invited his brothers. All the king's sons received invitations. This would be a family gathering, a chance for the royal siblings to enjoy themselves away from the formality of court. And Absalom went to the king. "I have sheep shearers," he said to his father. "Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." David declined. "We should not all go," he said, "lest we be a burden to you." The king understood that hosting royalty was expensive, that feeding and housing David and his entire entourage would strain even a wealthy man's resources. Or perhaps David simply felt too old for such festivities, preferring the comfort of his palace to the rustic celebration in the hills. Absalom pressed him. This insistence might have raised suspicions in a more cautious father, but David seems to have noticed nothing amiss. "If you will not come yourself," Absalom said, "please let my brother Amnon go with us." "Why should he go with you?" David asked. The question hangs in the text, unexplained. Did David sense something? Did some instinct warn him that this was not a simple request? Or was he merely curious why Absalom specifically wanted Amnon when all the brothers were invited anyway? But Absalom pressed him again, and David relented. He sent Amnon and all the king's sons to the feast. He blessed the gathering and sent them off, probably relieved that his sons were getting along well enough to celebrate together. 2 years had passed since Tamar's violation. Perhaps David thought the wound had healed, that time had done its work, that family bonds had reasserted themselves over temporary troubles. He could not have been more wrong. The royal sons traveled to Baal Hazor with their servants and attendants. The journey from Jerusalem would have taken several hours, long enough for anticipation to build, for wineskins to be opened on the road, for the princes to talk and laugh together. Amnon likely felt no concern. Why would he? Absalom had been civil to him for 2 years. The family had moved on. This feast was simply what it appeared to be, a celebration of a good season, a time for brothers to enjoy each other's company away from the pressures of court. The feast itself would have been elaborate. Sheep-shearing celebrations in that culture often lasted for days with abundant food and wine. Absalom, wealthy in his own right and eager to demonstrate his hospitality, would have spared no expense. Roasted lamb, fresh bread, honey, dried fruits, wine from his own vineyards. Musicians played. Servants moved among the guests, keeping cups filled and platters loaded. The atmosphere was festive, relaxed, exactly what such an occasion should be. And Absalom watched, waited. He had given his servants their instructions already. Now he simply needed the right moment. He watched Amnon's cup being filled and refilled, watched his half-brother's caution dissolve in wine and celebration. Watched until Amnon's heart was merry with drink, until his reflexes were slow, until his guard was completely down. Then Absalom gave the signal. When Amnon's heart is merry with wine, he had told his servants beforehand, "And when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." The servants fell upon Amnon, multiple men acting in concert, giving him no chance to defend himself or call for help. The crown prince, the firstborn son of King David, died at a feast among his own brothers, struck down by servants acting on the order of another prince. His blood soaked into the ground at Baal Hazor, and with it drained away the last possibility of peace in David's household. The other sons of the king saw what was happening and panicked. They leaped up from the feast, each man mounting his mule and fleeing. In their terror, they did not stay together or try to make sense of what had happened. They simply ran, convinced perhaps that Absalom meant to kill them all, that this was not revenge for Tamar but a coup, an attempt to eliminate all rivals to the throne in one bloody stroke. As they fled, rumor raced ahead of them. A messenger reached David before the princes did, bringing news garbled in the chaos. "Absalom has struck down all the king's sons," the report claimed, "and not one of them is left alive." David's response shows the depth of his paternal love and the horror of that moment. He tore his clothes, the ancient gesture of unbearable grief. He lay on the ground. His servants who stood around him also tore their clothes. The king's chamber became a scene of mourning. David prostrate on the floor, his mind unable to process the magnitude of the loss. All his sons, everyone, dead. But Jonadab, that same subtle counselor who had helped Amnon set his trap for Tamar, now spoke up. "Let not my lord suppose they have killed all the young men, the king's sons," he said, "for only Amnon is dead. This has been determined by Absalom from the day that he violated his sister Tamar." Jonadab's words reveal that what Absalom thought was a secret known only to a few was actually an open secret in the court. Everyone knew. Everyone had been waiting to see if and how Absalom would respond. And now the response had come, exactly as anyone with eyes to see could have predicted. The watchmen on Jerusalem's walls saw them next. A great company of people coming from the road behind him, from the hillside. The king's sons were returning, those who had survived, and soon they arrived. They came weeping, their voices raised in lamentation, confirming that Amnon was indeed dead. David and his household wept with them, the grief compounded by relief. Not all lost, but one lost, and that one the firstborn, the heir, the crown prince. But Absalom was gone. He had fled immediately after Amnon's death, not waiting to see the aftermath, not trying to justify his actions to his father. He ran to Geshur, to the kingdom of his grandfather Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of that Aramean state. There he would be safe from David's justice, protected by blood ties and political considerations. David could not simply demand his extradition without risking war with an allied kingdom. Absalom's choice of refuge was strategic, calculated like everything else he did. The text tells us that David mourned for his son every day. But which son? The grammar is ambiguous in Hebrew. Did he mourn for Amnon, dead and buried? Or for Absalom, alive but exiled, Separated from his father and his inheritance? Perhaps both. Perhaps David's heart was torn between grief for the son he had lost and longing for the son who had killed him. This divided heart would characterize David's relationship with Absalom for the rest of their lives. Love that could not discipline, mercy that enabled evil, a father's affection that blinded him to his son's true nature until it was far too late. David had failed to punish Amnon for the violation of Tamar, and that failure led directly to Amnon's murder. Now he failed to decisively deal with Absalom's crime, and that failure would lead to consequences even more catastrophic. In Geshur, Absalom began his exile. 3 years he would stay there, 3 years cut off, from Jerusalem, from court, from power, from his father's face. 3 years to consider what he had done and what it had cost him. 3 years to decide what kind of man he would become. Would he use this time to reflect, to repent, to find some way back to the father who loved him despite everything? Or would his resentment grow, feeding on itself the way his hatred for Amnon had grown, until he saw David not as beloved father, but as the obstacle between himself and the throne he increasingly believed should be his? The kingdom continued its daily business. Disputes were settled at the gates, taxes were collected, military patrols kept the borders secure. But everyone in Jerusalem knew that something fundamental had broken in the royal house. 2 princes were gone, one to the grave and one to exile. The succession was now uncertain. Amnon had been firstborn, but Chileab, the second son, was already long gone from the record, probably dead. That left Absalom as the next oldest, but he was a murderer and an exile. After him came Adonijah, son of Haggith, who perhaps began to see new possibilities opening before him. And Tamar remained in Absalom's house, still desolate, though now her violator was dead. Did his death bring her any peace? Did she feel vindicated that her brother had acted when her father would not? Or did she carry guilt, knowing that her suffering had set in motion the events that led to murder and exile? The text does not tell us. After this point, Tamar disappears from the narrative, her voice silenced, her story unfinished. A victim whose pain catalyzed catastrophe but who received no healing herself. David stood at his palace window, looking toward the northeast, toward Geshur, where his son lived in exile. His heart was torn. Justice demanded that Absalom face consequences for murder. But love cried out for reconciliation. The law said one thing, his paternal affection said another. And in his paralysis, in his inability to choose between justice and mercy, David prepared the ground for the final tragedy that would nearly destroy everything he had built. 3 years is long enough for a man to change, or long enough for him to become more deeply entrenched in who he has always been. Absalom spent those years in Geshur, a small Aramean kingdom northeast of the Sea of Galilee, ruled by his maternal grandfather Talmai. It was a place of refuge, certainly, but also a place of reflection and perhaps bitter calculation. A prince in exile has time to think, time to nurse grievances, time to decide whether he will return humbled or return hungry for what he believes is rightfully his. Geshur was not Jerusalem. It lacked the grandeur, the culture, the sense of being at the center of the world that David's capital possessed. But it was civilized enough, prosperous enough, safe enough. Absalom would have been treated as a prince in his grandfather's court, given apartments suitable to his station, provided with servants and the comforts appropriate to his rank. He was not imprisoned or suffering. He was simply removed from the place where his heart wanted to be, cut off from the city and the court and the future he had imagined for himself. Did his grandfather ask him about the murder? Did they discuss what had happened at that sheep-shearing feast, the blood spilled for honor's sake? Talmai would have understood such actions, perhaps even approved of them. In the honor-shame culture of the ancient Near East, what Absalom had done made perfect sense. A sister's violation demanded blood vengeance. That David had failed to act made Absalom's response not only justified but necessary. From this perspective, Absalom had done what any proper brother should do, and his exile was unjust punishment for fulfilling a family obligation. This viewpoint, reinforced daily in Gesher, would have shaped how Absalom thought about his situation. He was not a criminal fleeing justice, but a righteous man suffering for doing what was right. His father had failed to protect Tamar, failed to punish Amnon, failed to maintain order in his own household. And now David compounded those failures by keeping his avenging son in exile. Every day that passed without recall would have felt like another injustice added to the pile. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, David mourned. The Hebrew text says he mourned for his son, and as noted before, the ambiguity is profound. Amnon was dead, buried, gone. The grief for him was real but had a finality to it. Absalom was alive somewhere out there, separated not by death but by choice and consequence. That kind of grief has no closure. It renews itself each morning. It asks questions that cannot be answered. Could he come back? Should he come back? What would reconciliation look like? What would justice demand? David's heart was torn between his role as king and his identity as father. As king, he should have been firm. Murder, even murder in response to rape, could not go unpunished. The law was clear about blood guilt. The stability of the kingdom required that even princes answer for their crimes. To simply forgive Absalom and bring him back would send a terrible message that the powerful could kill with impunity, that royal blood exempted one from justice. But as father, David longed for his son. He remembered Absalom as a boy, that beautiful child with potential written all over him. He thought about the reasons behind the murder, the violation of Tamar that he himself had failed to address properly. He carried his own guilt, knowing that his inaction had created the conditions for tragedy. And he was getting older now, more aware of mortality, more conscious that time with his children was finite and precious. This internal conflict paralyzed him. He could not bring himself to formally pardon Absalom, but neither could he pursue justice against him. So Absalom remained in Gesher, and David remained in a state of unresolved grief. And the years passed, with nothing changing. It was Joab who finally broke the stalemate. Joab, David's nephew and commander of the army, was many things. Ruthless, certainly. Loyal to David in his own way, but also pragmatic and politically shrewd. He could see what David's paralysis was doing to the kingdom. The uncertainty about succession created instability. The unresolved tension weakened David's authority. And perhaps Joab also had his own reasons for wanting Absalom back. Calculations about future power dynamics, an assessment that Absalom would remember who had helped him in his time of need. But Joab knew David well enough to understand that a direct approach would fail. The king had dug himself into a position through years of inaction, and pride or principle or confusion kept him there. So Joab employed a stratagem, using the same kind of indirect wisdom that the prophet Nathan had once used to convict David of his sin with Bathsheba. He would tell David a story, create a parallel situation, get the king to pronounce judgment on a case that mirrored his own, and then reveal the truth. Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman. Tekoa was a town south of Jerusalem, and apparently it was known for having women skilled in persuasive speech, able to craft arguments and tell stories that moved hearts. Joab instructed this woman carefully. "Pretend to be a mourner," he told her. "Put on mourning garments, do not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who has been mourning for the dead for many days." Then he gave her the story to tell. She was to present herself to David as a widow with 2 sons who had fought in a field. One killed the other, and now the whole family was demanding that she hand over the surviving son to be executed for murder. This would leave her with no heir, no one to carry on her dead husband's name, no one to care for her in her old age. She would be left alone, her family line extinguished. The woman came to David and bowed with her face to the ground, showing the proper respect for the king while also demonstrating her desperate need. "Help, O king," she cried. David asked what troubled her, and she poured out her prepared story. She wept as she spoke, painting a picture of impossible choices. Justice demanded blood for blood, but that justice would destroy what little she had left. Her one remaining son was all she had in the world, and they wanted to take him from her. David's response came quickly. "As the Lord lives, she shall not lose a hair of her son's head. Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you." But the woman pressed further, getting David to make his commitment even more explicit, to swear an oath that her son would not be harmed. She maneuvered the conversation skillfully, and David, moved by her plight and perhaps not thinking too carefully about the implications, swore that no harm would come to her son. Then the woman struck. "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God?" she asked. "For in giving this decision the king convicts himself in that the king does not bring his banished one home again. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast." It was brilliantly done. She had gotten David to pronounce mercy on her situation, then revealed that his own situation was identical. She even provided theological justification, arguing that God himself seeks ways to restore the exiled rather than leave them cut off forever. And she appealed to David's sense of justice, pointing out the inconsistency between what he had just promised her and what he was doing to his own son. David immediately recognized Joab's hand in this. "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" he asked. The woman could not deny it. She admitted that Joab had put the words in her mouth, had orchestrated this whole encounter to change the king's heart. But she also praised David's wisdom, comparing him to an angel of God who knows all things on earth. David had been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. He called Joab to him. "Behold, now I grant this," he said. "Go, bring back the young man Absalom." Joab fell on his face and blessed the king, knowing he had achieved his goal. He traveled to Geshur to bring Absalom home after 3 long years of exile. One can imagine Absalom's reaction to the news. Relief, certainly. Vindication, perhaps. But also possibly resentment that it had taken so long, that his father had needed to be manipulated into this decision rather than reaching it through genuine desire for reconciliation. But David's permission came with a condition that Joab may not have anticipated or may have hoped could be overcome later. "Let him dwell in his own house," David commanded, "but let him not see my face." So Absalom returned to Jerusalem. He came back to the city he loved, back to his own property, back to proximity to power and influence. But he did not come back to relationship with his father. He was allowed in the city but banned from the court. He could live in Jerusalem but could not enter the king's presence. It was a half-reconciliation, an incomplete restoration that satisfied neither justice nor mercy, but hung suspended between them. Absalom dwelt in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face. He was home, but not home. Pardoned but not forgiven. Present but still separated. It was a recipe for further resentment, further grievance, further plotting. David had tried to split the difference between his roles as king and father, and in doing so had created a situation that would prove more dangerous than either full exile or full reconciliation might have been. 2 more years passed with Absalom living in Jerusalem but unable to see his father's face. 5 years total since that day at Baal Hazor when he had ordered his servants to strike down Amnon. 3 years in Gesher. 2 years back in Jerusalem, and through all of it, no real reconciliation. No genuine conversation with the father he had wronged and who had wronged him in return. Absalom was back in the city, walking its streets, managing his estates, visible to everyone, yet invisible to the one person whose acknowledgement mattered most. This half-status gnawed at him. He was a prince, son of the king, wealthy and influential in his own right. People still stopped to watch him pass, still admired his legendary beauty, still spoke of him with a mixture of awe and caution. But he could not enter the palace, could not attend court functions, could not participate in the councils where decisions about the kingdom were made, could not sit at his father's table or receive his father's blessing or hear his father's voice. He was home, but he was still an exile in every way that mattered. The situation was humiliating for a man of Absalom's pride. Every day reminded him that he was not fully restored, not fully trusted, not fully accepted back into the family. He saw his brothers come and go from the palace. He heard about court business secondhand. He watched from a distance as the kingdom moved forward without him, and the longer it went on, the more his resentment grew. He had killed for his sister's honor. He had done what his father should have done but failed to do. And this was his reward? To be kept at arm's length like a dangerous dog that might bite if allowed too close? The injustice of it consumed him. In his mind, the narrative probably went something like this. He had been righteous, David had been weak, and now David compounded his weakness by refusing to either punish properly or forgive fully. Absalom decided he needed to force the issue. He sent a message to Joab, asking him to come so that Absalom might send him to the king with a question. After all, it was Joab who had arranged his return. Joab who had intervened with the wise woman from Tekoa. Joab who had brought him back from Gesher. Surely Joab would help complete what he had started, would persuade David to finally grant his son a full audience. But Joab would not come. The message was ignored. Joab, that shrewd political operator, had perhaps realized that getting involved further in the tangle between David and Absalom was more dangerous than profitable. He had brought Absalom back as requested. What happened next was not his concern. Or perhaps he simply knew David well enough to understand that the king was not ready, that pushing harder would backfire, that some wounds needed more time even if the waiting was agony. Absalom sent a second message. Again, Joab refused to come. The general was avoiding him, and Absalom's frustration reached a breaking point. If Joab would not respond to polite requests, then Absalom would make ignoring him impossible. He would do something so outrageous, so provocative, that Joab would have no choice but to come. Absalom's field was next to Joab's field. Joab had barley growing there, almost ready for harvest, the result of months of labor, valuable both as food and as a cash crop. Absalom called his servants. See, he told them, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. They did exactly as he commanded. The servants went and set Joab's field ablaze. Fire in a barley field spreads quickly, consuming the dry stalks, destroying the entire crop in minutes. The smoke would have been visible across that part of Jerusalem, a pillar of destruction rising into the sky. It was deliberate, public, impossible to miss. It was Absalom announcing that he would not be ignored, that he would force action even if it meant destroying valuable property. The strategy worked. Joab came immediately, his anger barely contained. "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" he demanded. Absalom's response shows both his desperation and his twisted logic. "Look, I sent word to you. Come here that I may send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Gesher? It would be better for me to still be there. Now therefore let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death." Read those words carefully. Absalom frames his return to Jerusalem as pointless if he cannot see the king. Better to have stayed in exile, he claims, than to live in this limbo. And then he makes a stunning offer. Let me see the king, and if he finds me guilty, let him execute me. It sounds like someone seeking justice, willing to face consequences, but it is actually a brilliant piece of manipulation. Absalom knows David will not execute him. 5 years have passed. If David wanted him dead, he would be dead already. What Absalom is really saying is, end this charade one way or another, and we both know you do not have the stomach to end it with my death, so end it by fully restoring me. Joab went to the king and told him Absalom's words, and David finally relented. He sent for his son. After 5 years of separation, 3 in Geshur and 2 in Jerusalem, the king agreed to see the prince who had murdered the crown prince. Absalom came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before his father. It was the proper gesture of respect, of submission, of acknowledgement that David held all authority. Whether it was sincere or simply strategic, we cannot know. Perhaps Absalom himself did not know. Perhaps in that moment, seeing his father's face after so long, genuine emotion mixed with calculation, love tangled with resentment, relief complicated by pride, and the king kissed Absalom. David took his son in his arms and kissed him, the traditional sign of reconciliation and forgiveness. It should have been a moment of restoration, of healing, of new beginnings. Father and son together again. The breach repaired, the family made whole, but the text gives us no words between them. No conversation is recorded, no confession from Absalom, no forgiveness explicitly spoken by David. Just the physical gesture, the kiss, and then silence about what came after. This silence is itself significant. Real reconciliation requires honest conversation. It demands acknowledgement of wrong, expression of remorse, offering of forgiveness, and commitment to different behavior going forward. None of that appears in the text. What we have instead is a public gesture that resolved nothing internally. David had been pressured into this meeting, manipulated by Joab's earlier stratagem and now by Absalom's destruction of property and implicit threat to cause more problems if ignored. Absalom had forced his way back into his father's presence rather than being invited from the heart. The reconciliation was hollow, a performance for the benefit of the court and the city, checking a box labeled family unity restored without actually doing the hard work of restoration. Absalom now had access to the palace again. He could attend court. He could participate in royal functions. He could begin rebuilding his political position. From the outside, it looked like the problem had been solved. The king and his son were reconciled. Life could return to normal. The uncomfortable questions about succession could be ignored a while longer. Everything seemed fine, but everything was not fine. Absalom's heart had not changed. If anything, the 5 years of separation had hardened him, deepened his sense of grievance, convinced him that his father was weak and that weakness had consequences. He had watched from the sidelines while the kingdom operated without him, and he had formed opinions about what was wrong and how it should be fixed. He had burned Joab's field to force a meeting, showing that he was willing to destroy things to get what he wanted. And now, he had what he wanted: access, position, the ear of the powerful. David's heart had not changed either. He still could not bring himself to truly discipline his sons or to fully forgive them. He loved them too much to be hard with them, but not wisely enough to see where his softness was leading. He had let Amnon's crime against Tamar go unpunished, setting in motion the revenge that killed his firstborn. Now he was letting Absalom's murder go unaddressed beyond 5 years of partial exile, and that failure to properly deal with the crime would set in motion something even worse. The kiss in the palace that day was not reconciliation. It was a temporary ceasefire between two parties who had not actually resolved their fundamental differences. Absalom was back, but the question remained. What kind of son had returned? The beautiful prince, dutiful and loyal? Or something darker, more dangerous, more ambitious than David could imagine? Time would reveal the answer, and the revelation would break David's heart in ways that no enemy's sword ever could. After this, Absalom prepared for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. It was a statement. This procession, through Jerusalem's streets. A declaration that here was someone who mattered, someone worthy of attention, someone who understood power and how to display it. In the ancient world, such a retinue marked you as significant. Chariots were expensive, the domain of warriors and nobility. Horses required constant care and feeding. And 50 runners, men whose entire job was to clear the path ahead, to announce your coming, to make ordinary citizens step aside. That was the kind of extravagance that caught the eye and lodged in the memory. David had never done such a thing. The shepherd king, the man who had climbed from nothing to the throne, maintained a certain humility even in his glory. He moved through his city with guards, certainly, but not with this kind of ostentatious display. Absalom was making himself more visible, more impressive, more royal than the king himself. And if David noticed or objected, the text does not tell us. Perhaps he saw it as harmless vanity, a young man's need for attention. Perhaps he thought it better that Absalom channel his energy into display rather than into darker pursuits. Or perhaps David simply did not see the danger until it was far too late. But the chariot and the runners were just the beginning, the theatrical frame for something far more calculated. Absalom rose early each morning and positioned himself beside the road leading to the city gate. This was the place where justice happened in ancient Israel, where disputes were settled, where cases were heard, where the king or his appointed judges rendered decisions. Anyone seeking legal remedy had to pass through those gates, and Absalom made certain he was there to intercept them. When anyone came with a dispute to bring before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out to them. "What city are you from?" he would ask, engaging them in conversation, showing personal interest. And when they answered, telling him they were from one of the tribes of Israel, Absalom would draw them in further. Then he would ask about their case, letting them pour out their grievances, listening with apparent sympathy and attention. These were people who had traveled sometimes for days to seek justice in the capital. They came with legitimate problems, land disputes, inheritance questions, accusations of wrongdoing, conflicts that could not be resolved locally. They came hoping the king's justice would set things right. They came with hope that was often mixed with frustration at how long it took, how many layers of officials they had to navigate, how complicated the system seemed. And Absalom would listen to their stories, nodding in understanding. Then he would say something that sounded like validation but was actually poison. "Look, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." It was a lie, or at least a profound distortion of truth. David had established a system of justice. There were officials, judges, processes in place. The system might not have been perfect, might have been slow at times, might have left some people frustrated. But it functioned. Cases were heard. Decisions were rendered. Justice was done, even if not as quickly or as perfectly as everyone might have wished. But Absalom painted a different picture. He suggested that David had abandoned his responsibilities, that the king no longer cared about the common people's problems, that legitimate grievances went unheard and unaddressed, and then he would add the crucial line, "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." Imagine hearing these words if you were one of those travelers seeking justice. Here was the king's own son, this beautiful, charismatic prince, telling you that your case was worthy, that you deserved better, that if he were in charge, you would receive the justice being denied to you now. It felt like validation. It felt like someone powerful finally saw your problem and cared about it. It felt like hope. And when anyone approached him to bow down in respect, as was proper when addressing royalty, Absalom would not allow it. He would put out his hand and take hold of them and kiss them. This gesture was deliberately calculated to break down the barriers between prince and people, to create a sense of intimacy and equality, to make ordinary citizens feel that Absalom was one of them rather than above them. David might be distant, might be remote in his palace, might have lost touch with the common people. But Absalom was here, accessible, warm, concerned about your problems. This went on morning after morning. Absalom positioned himself at the gate not occasionally but consistently, making it a known feature of Jerusalem life. People would say to each other, if you are going to the capital to seek justice, make sure to speak with Absalom on your way in. He actually listens. He actually cares. And slowly, steadily, systematically, Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Notice that verb, stole. Not won, not earned, but stole. He was not actually improving anything or fixing any problems. He was not reforming the justice system or making it more efficient. He was not adjudicating cases or rendering decisions. He was simply sympathizing, promising, and undermining. He was creating the perception of a crisis where none existed, positioning himself as the solution to problems he was helping to manufacture. This is the psychology of populist rebellion, and it works remarkably well because it taps into real frustrations and magnifies them. Every system of government has flaws. Every administration makes mistakes. Every official sometimes fails to give people what they want. Absalom took these ordinary imperfections and framed them as evidence of fundamental failure. He took normal delays in justice and presented them as deliberate neglect. He took the regular friction of any legal system and portrayed it as the king's abandonment of his people. And people believed him because he was beautiful, because he was charismatic, because he seemed to care, and because he told them what they wanted to hear. That their problems were not their own fault, but the fault of distant, uncaring leadership. That they deserved better. That someone understood them and would fight for them if given the chance. What made Absalom's campaign particularly effective was that it was personal. He did not give speeches to crowds. He did not issue proclamations. He had individual conversations, one person at a time, one case at a time, one moment of apparent empathy at a time. Those individual encounters added up. People went back to their towns and villages and told others, I met Prince Absalom, and he actually listened to me. He said my case was just. He said if he were judge, he would help people like us. The message spread through Israel like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Absalom's name became associated with justice, with concern for the common people, with a vision of how things could be better. And by implication, David's name became associated with neglect, with distance, with a king who had lost touch with his people's needs. None of this was true, but truth mattered less than perception. And Absalom was masterfully shaping perception. David seems to have been completely unaware of what was happening. He saw his son being active, engaging with people, showing interest in the kingdom's affairs. Perhaps he was even pleased, thinking this showed Absalom had matured, that he was taking his responsibilities seriously, that the troubled young man who had murdered his brother was becoming a contributing member of the royal family. David had always wanted his sons to be involved, to be capable, to be worthy of the positions they held. But Absalom was not building up the kingdom, he was building up himself. Every conversation at the gate was a brick in the foundation of his own power base. Every sympathetic word was an investment in future loyalty. Every kiss was a bond that would be called upon when the time came. And Absalom was patient. He did not rush. He did not reveal his true intentions. He simply showed up day after day, year after year, stealing hearts one at a time, until he had built a following large enough to challenge the throne itself. The text tells us this went on for a significant period. Absalom was playing a long game, understanding that real loyalty cannot be rushed, that trust takes time to build, that if he wanted to succeed in what he was planning, he needed a foundation solid enough to support the weight of revolution. He needed people who would not just admire him but would fight for him, who would see him not just as a prince but as their champion, their hope, their future. And slowly and visibly to those who were not paying attention, Absalom built that foundation. The men of Israel from all the tribes, from north to south, began to look toward Absalom rather than David. They began to speak his name with affection and hope. They began to believe that this beautiful prince understood them in ways the aging king did not. They began to imagine what the kingdom might be like under different leadership. Absalom had learned from his earlier mistakes. When he killed Amnon, he had acted impulsively on rage, however long he had planned it. He had struck without building support, without creating a political foundation, without ensuring he had backing beyond his own household. That mistake had cost him 5 years. But now he was older, wiser, more calculating. Now he understood that power comes not just from bold action, but from patient preparation. Now he knew that if he wanted the throne, he needed not just the courage to seize it, but the support to hold it. The chariot rolled through Jerusalem's streets each morning. The 50 runners cleared the path. Absalom took his position at the gate, and heart by heart, conversation by conversation, promise by promise, he built the coalition that would soon set the kingdom ablaze. 4 years. That is how long Absalom worked at his campaign before he moved to open rebellion. 4 years of mornings at the city gate, 4 years of sympathetic conversations and strategic kisses. 4 years of building networks, making promises, identifying who could be turned and who would remain loyal to David. 4 years of patient, methodical preparation for the greatest act of betrayal a son could commit against his father. Think about what 4 years means. It is not a moment of passion or a rash decision made in anger. It is sustained, deliberate effort. It is waking up each morning with a plan and executing that plan day after day, month after month, season after season. It is maintaining a false face, smiling at your father while plotting his overthrow, sitting at his table while stealing his kingdom bite by bite. It requires a special kind of coldness, a compartmentalization of heart that can separate what you show from what you feel, what you promise from what you intend. During those 4 years, Absalom did not just win general popularity. He recruited specific men, identified key supporters in every tribe, built an actual conspiracy with structure and coordination. This was not a spontaneous uprising that would erupt randomly. This was an organized coup being prepared in plain sight, camouflaged by Absalom's public persona as the prince who cared about justice and the people's welfare. He needed men from every tribe because Israel, even under David's united monarchy, remained a collection of tribal territories with their own identities and interests. The northern tribes still remembered that they had their own traditions, their own heroes, their own history separate from Judah. The division that would later split the kingdom after Solomon's death was already present beneath the surface. Absalom was wise enough to understand this. He could not rely solely on his own tribe or his own region. He needed support spread across the entire nation if his rebellion was to succeed. So he identified influential men in each tribal territory, elders who felt overlooked by David's administration, warriors who believed they deserved more recognition or higher positions. wealthy landowners who had disputes with royal policy, younger men who saw in Absalom's youth and beauty a reflection of their own ambitions, who believed the aging David represented the past while Absalom represented the future. Each man had his own reasons for being receptive to Absalom's message, and Absalom was skilled enough to identify those reasons and speak to them. Some he won through flattery, making them feel seen and valued in ways they believed David did not. Some he won through promises of position and power in the new administration he would establish. Some he won through shared grievance, real or manufactured. Some he won simply through the force of his personality, the charisma that made people want to follow him, want to believe in him, want to be part of something he was creating. The conspiracy had to remain secret, at least in its full scope. Absalom could not openly declare his intentions years in advance, but he could have private conversations, coded language, careful recruitment of those he could trust. He could identify men who were already discontented with David's rule and give them hope that change was possible. He could build cells of support in different regions that did not necessarily know about each other but would respond when the signal came. Jerusalem itself had to be carefully managed. The city was David's stronghold, filled with people loyal to the king who had made them prosperous and safe. But even there, Absalom found support. Some resented the old guard who held power. Some saw opportunity in aligning with the next generation of leadership. Some simply liked Absalom better than they liked David, preferring charm to gravitas, beauty to battle scars, promises to history. Absalom also had to manage the royal household itself. His brothers were potential rivals or potential allies. Adonijah, now the oldest surviving son after Amnon's death, might have expected to be next in line for the throne. Did Absalom secure his support, or was Adonijah kept in the dark? The text does not tell us, but Adonijah's later attempt to seize the throne suggests these brothers were not working together, but rather both plotting their own paths to power. Among David's counselors, Absalom made his most significant recruit, Ahithophel the Gilonite, that man whose counsel was like the oracle of God, that trusted advisor whose wisdom David had relied upon for years, turned to Absalom's cause. The reasons may have been personal. Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather, and the murder of Uriah had brought shame to his family. Or the reasons may have been political, a calculation that David's best days were behind him and that Absalom represented the future. Or perhaps Ahithophel simply believed Absalom would make a better king, that the son had the qualities the father now lacked. Whatever his motivation, Ahithophel's defection was crucial. He brought not just his own reputation and wisdom, but also credibility to Absalom's cause. If the wisest counselor in the kingdom believed Absalom should be king, then perhaps many others felt justified in believing the same. And Ahithophel would prove invaluable in planning the actual mechanics of the rebellion, ensuring that Absalom did not just seize power but had a strategy for holding it. Through all of this, David noticed nothing, or if he noticed, he dismissed what he saw as harmless activity. His son was popular with the people. Good. His son took an interest in justice. Admirable. His son was building relationships across the tribes. Excellent preparation for whatever role he would play in the kingdom's future. David had spent so many years fighting external enemies that he could not conceive of the enemy within his own house, within his own bloodline, within the heart of the son he loved. This blindness was not just about Absalom. It was about David's fundamental inability to properly judge or discipline his children. He had failed with Amnon, letting that son's crime go unpunished until Absalom took matters into his own hands. He had failed with Absalom, neither fully punishing the murder nor fully forgiving it, creating the conditions of resentment that fueled this conspiracy. And he was failing again now, unable to see that his mercy was being exploited, that his love was being weaponized against him. Perhaps some in David's court tried to warn him. Perhaps some loyal servants or advisors noticed Absalom's activities and felt uneasy about them. But if they spoke up, David did not listen. Or perhaps they too were blinded by Absalom's performance, convinced by the same charm that was winning the hearts of Israel. It is easy to believe the best about someone who seems so manifestly good, so concerned about justice, so engaged with the people. It is hard to imagine that such apparent virtue could mask such profound betrayal. The conspiracy grew like a cancer, invisible until it was nearly too late to stop. It spread through the tribal networks, through whispered conversations in marketplaces, through coded messages carried by trusted servants, through meetings held far from Jerusalem where David's eyes could not see. Men made commitments to Absalom, pledging their support when the time came. Resources were quietly repositioned, weapons were cached, alliances were formed, plans were made. And still Absalom came to the palace, smiled at his father, participated in royal functions, played the role of dutiful son. The kiss David had given him years before seemed to have established real reconciliation. Father and son appeared at peace. The family tragedy seemed to have been overcome. Jerusalem saw a king and his prince working together, and everything looked stable and secure. But beneath that surface, everything was ready. Absalom had built his foundation carefully and thoroughly. He had identified his supporters, secured his resources, planned his strategy, chosen his moment. 4 years of patient work was about to bear fruit. 4 years of poison carefully administered was about to paralyze the kingdom. 4 years of betrayal hidden behind a beautiful face was about to explode into civil war. The text tells us it was after 4 years that Absalom made his move. Some manuscripts say 40 years, but most scholars agree this is either a copying error or refers to some other dating system because David did not reign 40 years before Absalom's rebellion. 4 years makes sense. 4 years after the reconciliation, after the kiss in the palace, after Absalom regained access to court and city. 4 years of preparation hidden in plain sight. Looking back, the signs were all there. The chariot and the runners that marked Absalom as someone seeking power beyond his current station. The daily presence at the gates that had nothing to do with actual administration but everything to do with winning loyalty. The careful cultivation of popular support that went far beyond what a prince needed simply to be well liked. The web of connections being built across tribal lines. The recruitment of key advisors like Ahithophel. All of it pointed toward what was coming. But David did not see it, could not see it, would not see it until the moment came when denial was no longer possible. And by then the conspiracy was so far advanced, so deeply rooted, so thoroughly prepared that David would have no choice but to flee his own capital or face immediate destruction. 4 years of patient poison was about to bring the kingdom to its knees. And the son David loved more than his own life was about to break his father's heart in a way no enemy ever had. After 4 years of careful preparation, Absalom came to his father with what seemed like a simple, pious request. The moment had arrived to spring the trap, but it required one final deception, one last exploitation of David's trust and his inability to suspect evil in his beloved son. "Please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow that I have made to the Lord," Absalom said. "For your servant made a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram, saying, 'If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord in Hebron.'" It was a brilliant lie because it sounded so believable, so righteous. Religious vows were taken seriously in ancient Israel. If a man promised God something, he was obligated to fulfill that promise. And Absalom was framing this as something he had vowed during his darkest time, during his exile in Geshur when he did not know if he would ever see Jerusalem again. He was presenting himself as a man who wanted to thank God for restoration, who took his spiritual obligations seriously, who sought to honor the Lord properly. Hebron added another layer of believability. This was not just any city. Hebron was where David himself had first been anointed king over Judah, where he had ruled for 7.5 years before capturing Jerusalem and uniting the kingdom. It was a place heavy with significance, a city in Judah with deep connections to David's own rise to power. For Absalom to want to worship there seemed natural, even touching. He was honoring his father's history while fulfilling his own vow. David suspected nothing. "Go in peace," he told his son. He blessed the journey, probably pleased that Absalom was showing such devotion to the Lord, probably seeing this as further evidence that his troubled son had matured into a responsible prince. David had always been a man of deep faith despite his sins. Seeing that same faith in his son must have warmed his heart. Absalom left Jerusalem with David's blessing, but he did not go alone. He took with him 200 men from Jerusalem, men who were invited as guests and went innocently, knowing nothing of Absalom's actual intentions. These men lent legitimacy to the journey. They were witnesses that this was an official proceeding, a royal delegation going to perform a religious ceremony. They were also, though they did not know it yet, hostages to fortune who would find themselves caught up in rebellion whether they wanted to be or not. But Absalom had sent other messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel before he left Jerusalem. These were his conspirators, the men he had recruited over 4 years, the network he had built across the nation. And they carried specific instructions. "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet," the message said, "then you shall say, 'Absalom is king at Hebron.'" This was the signal everyone had been waiting for. The moment when preparation became action. The moment when conspiracy became rebellion. The moment when the son would openly declare himself against the father. Absalom had chosen his timing carefully. He was in Hebron, the symbolic heart of Judah, David's own tribe, David's own power base. The declaration would carry weight because of where it happened. And by the time David heard about it in Jerusalem, Absalom would already have momentum, already have forces gathering to him, already have transformed from prince to rival king. Absalom also sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, summoning him from his city of Gilo, while Absalom was offering the sacrifices. This was crucial. Ahithophel's defection needed to be public and dramatic. His presence with Absalom would signal to many who were wavering that this rebellion had serious backing, that wise and experienced men believed in Absalom's cause. And Ahithophel's strategic mind would be invaluable in the coming days as they moved from declaration to actual seizure of power. The conspiracy grew strong. People kept joining Absalom, drawn by the message spreading across Israel, by the momentum building, by the sense that something historic was happening, and they wanted to be on the right side of it. Some came because they had been part of the 4-year recruitment. Some came because they heard Absalom had declared himself king and calculated that joining early would bring rewards. Some came because they believed the propaganda about David's neglect and Absalom's justice. Some came simply because they were ambitious or discontented and saw opportunity in upheaval. Then a messenger came to David with the news that shattered his world. "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom," the messenger reported. "Your son has declared himself king at Hebron, and people are flocking to him." Imagine David in that moment. The aging warrior, the man who had built this kingdom through blood and genius, the king who had defeated every external enemy, learning that his own son had turned the people against him. Learning that while he had trusted and loved, Absalom had schemed and recruited. Learning that the conspiracy was already so advanced, so widespread that immediate action was necessary just to survive. David's response shows both his military brilliance and his emotional devastation. He did not try to deny what was happening. He did not pretend it would blow over or that his authority would automatically prevail. He assessed the situation with brutal clarity and made the hardest decision of his life. "Arise and let us flee," he told his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." David was abandoning Jerusalem, the city he had captured from the Jebusites, the city he had made his capital, the city that bore his stamp on every building and street. He was fleeing rather than fighting, at least for now. And his reasoning was sound. If Absalom's forces reached Jerusalem before David could organize a defense, the city would become a battlefield. Civilians would die. The city would be destroyed. Better to withdraw, preserve his loyal forces, and choose ground where he could fight effectively. The king's servants responded with loyalty that must have been some comfort in that dark hour. "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides." David left the city on foot and all his household after him. But he left 10 concubines to keep the house. This decision would have terrible consequences that David could not foresee in that moment of crisis. The king went out with all the people following him, and they halted at the last house at the edge of the city as the stream of refugees and loyal troops organized themselves for the exodus. All his servants passed by him, and all the Cherethites and Pelethites, David's elite foreign mercenary troops who had no tribal loyalties in Israel and therefore remained faithful to the king who paid them. All the 600 men of Goth who had followed David from the Philistine city also passed by, led by Ittai the Gittite. These were foreigners who had attached themselves to David during his years of warfare, and their loyalty now proved truer than that of many Israelites. David tried to send Ittai back, telling him he was a foreigner and an exile, and did not need to share in Israel's civil war. But Ittai refused. "As the Lord lives," Ittai swore, "and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." So Ittai marched with David and all his men and all the little ones who were with him. The text emphasizes that little ones, children, were part of this desperate flight. This was not just a military withdrawal, but an entire household, an entire court, families and servants and camp followers, streaming out of Jerusalem in fear for their lives. David crossed the brook Kidron, that small stream in the valley east of Jerusalem, symbolic boundary between the city and the wilderness beyond. All the people passed over toward the wilderness, heading east and north, putting distance between themselves and Absalom's approaching forces. The priests came too, Zadok and Abiathar and the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant, that most sacred object in Israel, the physical representation of God's presence with his people. But David stopped them. "Carry the Ark of God back into the city," he commanded. "If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, 'I have no pleasure in you,' behold, here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him." This moment reveals David's faith even in catastrophe. He would not use the ark as a good luck charm or a military asset. He would not presume on God's favor. He submitted himself to whatever God decided was just, even if that meant his own destruction. And practically, he was also thinking strategically. The priests in Jerusalem could serve as his eyes and ears, sending information about what Absalom was doing. The procession continued up the Mount of Olives, that ridge east of the city, and David wept as he went, his head covered and walking barefoot, the traditional signs of mourning and humiliation. All the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up weeping as they went. They were not just fleeing an enemy army, they were fleeing the king's own son, and the tragedy of that reality weighed on everyone. Someone told David that Ahithophel was among the conspirators with Absalom. This news hit hard. Ahithophel's wisdom had guided David through countless decisions. His defection meant Absalom had access to the best strategic advice in the kingdom. "O Lord," David prayed, "please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." As David reached the summit of the Mount of Olives where people worshipped God, he found one ray of hope. Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat torn and dirt on his head. Hushai was another of David's counselors, and he had come to join the king in exile. But David saw a different purpose for him. "If you go on with me," David said, "you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so now I will be your servant,' then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. The priests are there who will send information through their sons. Whatever you hear, you shall send word to me." So Hushai returned to Jerusalem just as Absalom was entering the city. David's spy was in place. His loyal priests were positioned to help. But the king himself was in the wilderness, an exile once again, as he had been in his youth when fleeing from Saul. The wheel had turned full circle, and David was running for his life from someone who should have loved him most. The procession of refugees stretched along the road leading away from Jerusalem, a living river of humanity flowing east into the wilderness. It was not an army on the march, but a wounded court in flight, carrying whatever could be grabbed in haste, leaving behind homes and security and certainty. The dust rose from thousands of feet, clouding the air, coating everyone in a fine layer of grit that mixed with tears and sweat to streak their faces with the visible mark of catastrophe. David walked at the head of this sad parade, but he walked as a mourner, not as a king. His head was covered, the traditional gesture of shame and grief. His feet were bare, feeling every stone on the road, every thorn, every sharp edge. This was not just practical humility, but deliberate symbolism. David was presenting himself before God and before his people as a man brought low, as someone who acknowledged that this disaster carried divine judgment, that his sins had led to this moment of reckoning. Behind him, all the people who remained loyal covered their own heads and wept as they walked. The text emphasizes this collective weeping, this shared grief that was about more than just physical displacement. They were mourning the death of security, the shattering of the illusion that David's kingdom was unshakable. They were mourning the betrayal that had made this flight necessary. They were mourning the civil war they all knew was coming, brother against brother, tribe against tribe, the nation tearing itself apart. Among those who fled with David were men who had been with him since his outlaw years, warriors who had shared caves and hardship when Saul hunted them through the wilderness. For them, this must have felt like a terrible repetition of the past, as if all the victories and glory of the intervening years had been erased, as if they were back where they started, running for their lives with David leading them into an uncertain future. But they stayed. Whatever else could be said about them, they stayed. The Cherethites and Pelethites marched in formation, professional soldiers maintaining discipline even in disaster. These foreign mercenaries, likely Cretan and Philistine in origin, had no tribal connection to Israel's politics. They served David because he paid them, because he led them well, because he had earned their loyalty through competence and fair treatment. Now that loyalty was being tested, and they did not fail it. In a kingdom where David's own people had turned against him, these foreigners remained true. Ittai the Gittite led his 600 men from Gath, that Philistine city that had once been enemy territory but now provided some of David's most reliable troops. When David had tried to release Ittai from obligation, telling him to go back since he was a foreigner who had only recently arrived, Ittai's response had been passionate and absolute. "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." These were not empty words. Ittai was marching into potential death, and he knew it, and he chose it anyway out of loyalty to a king who was not even his own people. The priests came with the Ark of the Covenant, that golden chest containing the tablets of the law, the physical representation of God's covenant with Israel. Zadok and Abiathar, the high priests and the Levites who served them, carried this most sacred object out of Jerusalem, believing that where David went, God's presence should go. It was a powerful symbol suggesting that legitimacy itself was fleeing the city, that the true king was the one in exile, not the one claiming the throne in Jerusalem. But David made them turn back. His reasoning was layered. On one level, it was spiritual submission. If God was judging him, then God's presence should remain in Jerusalem. David would not manipulate sacred objects to serve his own ends. If God wanted him to return, then God would bring him back. If not, then David accepted that judgment. This was not fatalism, but faith, trust that whatever happened would be what should happen, that God's purposes would work themselves out regardless of David's efforts to control them. On another level, it was strategic brilliance. With the priests in Jerusalem, David had a communication network. Zadok and Abiathar could observe what Absalom was doing, could gather intelligence, could send messages through their sons Ahimaaz and Jonathan. David was turning his spiritual leaders into spies, and they were willing to play that role because they understood what was at stake. The ark returned to Jerusalem, and with it went David's eyes and ears in the enemy's camp. As David ascended the Mount of Olives, each step taking him farther from his city, farther from his throne, farther from the life he had built, messengers continued to bring news. Some of it confirmed what he already knew. Absalom had entered Jerusalem. The city had fallen without a fight because David had withdrawn. The palace was now occupied by the rebel prince, but other news brought fresh wounds. Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. This hit David like a physical blow. Ahithophel had been more than a counselor. He had been a trusted advisor whose wisdom David had relied upon for decades. When Ahithophel spoke, it was said to be like inquiring of the oracle of God. His advice was almost supernaturally good, his strategic insights nearly perfect. And now that wisdom was being turned against David, placed in service of Absalom's rebellion. David's prayer in response was simple and desperate. "O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." He could not undo the betrayal, but he could ask God to neutralize it, to confuse Absalom's planning, to make even the best advice somehow fail in execution. It was all David could do in that moment, and he did it, throwing himself on God's mercy once again. At the summit of the Mount of Olives, at the place where people worshipped God, David found Hushai the Archite waiting for him. Hushai had torn his coat and put dirt on his head, the signs of deep mourning, and he was ready to follow David into exile. But David saw a better use for this loyal friend. "If you go on with me, you will be a burden to me," David said. "But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king,' then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel." It was asking Hushai to risk his life. If Absalom suspected that Hushai was still loyal to David, he would be executed as a spy. But Hushai accepted the mission. He would return to Jerusalem, present himself as a turncoat willing to serve the new king, and then work to undermine Ahithophel's advice from within. And because Hushai was known as David's friend, his apparent defection would carry weight with Absalom. The young prince would see it as further evidence that even David's closest associates recognized that the cause was lost, that Absalom's victory was inevitable. David gave Hushai detailed instructions. "The priests Zadok and Abiathar are there with you. Whatever you hear from the king's house, tell it to them. Their two sons, Ahimaaz the son of Zadok and Jonathan the son of Abiathar, are there as well." Send them to me with any information you learn. A spy network was being established, fragile and dependent on men willing to risk everything. But it was something. It was hope where hope was scarce. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. The timing was perfect, providential perhaps. Absalom would see Hushai among those greeting him, among those apparently welcoming the new king. The deception was in place. But David's departure continued, each mile taking him deeper into the wilderness, farther from civilization and safety. The road descended into the Jordan Valley, harsh country where water was scarce and the heat could kill. Some of those fleeing were elderly, some were children, some were servants unprepared for this kind of journey. People began to falter, to need rest, to require care that was difficult to provide on the move. At Bahurim, a town on the eastern edge of Jerusalem's territory, they encountered Shimei, son of Gera, a man from Saul's family, from the tribe of Benjamin, and Shimei did something shocking. He cursed David. He threw stones at the king and at all his servants, even at the mighty warriors who surrounded David for protection. And he shouted, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. These were terrible words, public humiliation heaped upon a king already brought low. Shimei was saying that David's downfall was divine judgment for whatever role David had played in Saul's death and the deaths of Saul's sons. He was saying that Absalom's rebellion was God's punishment, that David deserved this, that the blood David had shed throughout his reign was now coming back upon his own head. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, one of David's most fierce warriors, immediately offered to solve the problem. Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head. It would have been easy. One sword stroke and Shimei's curses would end permanently. No one would have blamed David for allowing it. Kings did not tolerate such public disrespect, especially not in front of their armies. But David stopped him. What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who then shall say, why have you done so? Behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjaminite? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. This response reveals something profound about David's state of mind. He saw even this humiliation as potentially from God, as something he should endure rather than prevent. He acknowledged that if his own son was seeking his life, he could hardly be surprised that others piled on with their own grievances. And he held on to hope that somehow, through all this suffering, God might show mercy, might turn even curses into blessings, might work good from evil. So David and his men went on the road while Shimei went along on the hillside opposite him and cursed as he went and threw stones and flung dust. The image is almost surreal. A king on the run, a member of the old dynasty cursing him from across the valley. Stones and dust flying, and David simply enduring it, absorbing the abuse, refusing to retaliate. Finally, they reached the Jordan River. The king and all the people who were with him arrived weary and exhausted, and there they refreshed themselves, camping by the river, drinking the water, trying to regain strength for whatever came next. They had escaped Jerusalem, but they had not escaped their crisis. Absalom held the capital. The kingdom was divided, civil war was coming, and David, that great warrior who had never lost a battle, now faced his greatest challenge, fighting against his own son, knowing that victory would mean grief, and defeat would mean death. While David and his followers struggled through the wilderness, exhausted and grief-stricken, Absalom entered Jerusalem in triumph. The city that had been David's for decades opened its gates to the beautiful prince who promised justice and renewal. People lined the streets to watch him pass with his chariot and his runners, with his growing army of supporters, with the momentum of what seemed like inevitable victory. The capital had changed hands without a battle, and to many who watched, it appeared that God himself had ordained this transfer of power. Absalom went immediately to the palace, that complex of buildings his father had built and expanded over years of prosperity. He walked through rooms where he had grown up, past courtyards where he had played as a child, into chambers of state where his father had ruled. Now these spaces were his. The throne was his. The authority was his. Everything David had possessed now belonged to the son who had betrayed him. And Hushai the Archite, David's friend and secret agent, came to Absalom. "Long live the king!" Hushai shouted. "Long live the king!" He repeated it, making his apparent enthusiasm clear to everyone watching. This was exactly the kind of defection that would encourage others. If David's own friend and counselor now acclaimed Absalom, then surely the cause was decided. But Absalom was not stupid. He looked at Hushai with suspicion. "Is this your loyalty to your friend?" he asked. "Why did you not go with your friend?" The question was a test. Absalom knew that Hushai and David had been close. Hushai's sudden appearance in Jerusalem, proclaiming loyalty to the new regime, could be genuine opportunism, or it could be something more dangerous. Hushai's answer was carefully crafted. "No," he said, "for whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain." And again, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? "As I have served your father, so I will serve you." The argument was clever. Hushai was suggesting that God had chosen Absalom through the people's choice, that the successful entry into Jerusalem proved divine approval. And he was framing his service not as betrayal of David, but as natural continuation. He had served the father, now he would serve the son. It was the kind of reasoning that many were using to justify their own defections, and it sounded plausible enough that Absalom accepted it. Hushai was admitted to the inner council, positioned exactly where David needed him to be. Absalom turned to Ahithophel, that wisest of counselors who had abandoned David to serve the rebellion. "Give your counsel," Absalom commanded. "What shall we do?" The young prince had seized the city, but holding it and securing his position required strategy. He needed to consolidate power quickly, to make his claim irreversible, to ensure that those who had joined him could not easily return to David's side. Ahithophel's counsel was brutal and calculated. "Go into your father's concubines," he advised, "whom he has left to keep the house. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened." The suggestion was shocking, but its strategic logic was clear. In the ancient Near East, a king's harem was a symbol of his authority and power. For someone to take a king's wives or concubines was to claim that king's position absolutely. It was a declaration that could not be walked back, a line that once crossed made reconciliation impossible. When Absalom publicly violated David's concubines, he would be making a statement that he was truly king now, that he had utterly replaced his father, that there could be no compromise or power-sharing arrangement. Ahithophel understood human psychology. Many who had joined Absalom might still have harbored secret thoughts that perhaps reconciliation could happen, that perhaps David and Absalom could work out some arrangement, that perhaps they could end up on the winning side regardless of how things turned out. Such hedging of bets was natural in any rebellion, but if Absalom did what Ahithophel suggested, those thoughts would die. Everyone who supported Absalom would know they were fully committed, that David would never forgive this particular outrage, that they had to see the rebellion through to victory or face the consequences of total defeat. And there was a deeper cruelty in the advice, a layer of meaning that Ahithophel certainly understood and that Absalom may or may not have fully grasped. David had taken Bathsheba, another man's wife, committing adultery on a rooftop in Jerusalem. Now Absalom would take David's own women, committing a public violation on a rooftop in Jerusalem. The parallel was deliberate. What David had done in secret, Absalom would do openly. The sin was being revisited upon the sinner. The judgment Nathan had prophesied years earlier was being fulfilled in the most painful way possible. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof of the palace. This was the same roof, or very near it, where David had walked that fateful evening when he saw Bathsheba bathing. The same roof where so much tragedy had begun. And now it became the stage for more tragedy, more sin, more irreversible damage to already shattered relationships. Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. The text emphasizes the public nature of the act. This was not done privately. It was done where people could see, or at least where everyone would know it was happening. The tent on the roof was visible. The purpose was clear. Absalom was defiling his father's household in the most intimate way possible, demonstrating total dominance, making reconciliation impossible. The 10 concubines David had left behind to keep the house became victims of political calculation. They had not chosen to stay in Jerusalem. They had been ordered to remain by David as he fled. They had not chosen to be part of Absalom's statement. They were used as props in a drama of power and violation. Their bodies became the battlefield on which this struggle between father and son played out, and they had no voice in any of it. What did those women feel as they were violated by their master's son? Shame, certainly. Terror, absolutely. Rage, perhaps. A sense of utter powerlessness in a world where men used women as symbols and weapons without regard for their humanity. The text does not tell us. Ancient narratives rarely concerned themselves with the inner lives of women who had no power. But the silence speaks its own truth about the cost of men's ambitions, about the victims who are never named in the grand sweep of history. For Absalom, this act was the crossing of the Rubicon. There would be no going back now, no possibility of his father forgiving him, no chance of working out some power-sharing arrangement or peaceful resolution. He had not just taken the throne, he had desecrated everything his father held dear. He had not just declared himself king, he had declared his father's complete destruction as his only possible goal. The text adds a comment about Ahithophel's counsel. In those days, the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. Both David and Absalom treated Ahithophel's advice this way. His wisdom was legendary, his strategic insight nearly perfect. When he spoke, people listened as if God himself was speaking through him. This made him invaluable to Absalom, but it also made him dangerous to David. Everything now depended on whether Ahithophel's counsel could be countered, whether his strategic genius could somehow be neutralized. All across Jerusalem, people heard what Absalom had done. Some were shocked by the audacity and the cruelty of it. Some saw it as strength, as a young king who would not shrink from hard decisions. Some understood the strategic necessity even if they found it distasteful. Some began to doubt their choice to support Absalom, wondering what kind of man would do such a thing to his own father. But all understood the same thing. The point of no return had been passed. This was no longer a dispute that could be mediated or a family quarrel that could be resolved. This was total war, and only one side could survive. In the wilderness, David would eventually hear what his son had done. The humiliation, the violation, the deliberate cruelty of it all. Another wound added to wounds already almost unbearable. His city was taken, his throne was claimed, his counselor had betrayed him, his people had turned against him, and now his concubines had been violated publicly, specifically to shame him, specifically to make reconciliation impossible. Every report brought fresh pain, fresh evidence of how completely Absalom had turned against him. But Absalom did not take time to savor his victory. He could not afford to. David was still alive, still had an army, still had loyal followers. The longer David remained free to organize resistance, the more dangerous he became. Experienced warriors who had spent their lives following David were with him now. Given time, they could turn from refugees into an effective fighting force. Given time, tribes that had initially supported Absalom might reconsider as they saw the cost of civil war mounting. Absalom needed to finish this quickly. He needed to strike at David before David could recover and regroup. He needed to end the threat permanently, which meant David had to die. Not be defeated or captured or exiled, but killed. Only David's death would secure Absalom's position completely, would end any hope of a counter-rebellion, would allow the kingdom to move forward under new leadership. So Absalom turned again to Ahithophel, seeking counsel on what to do next. How do we destroy David? How do we end this before it becomes a prolonged war that tears the nation apart? The wise counselor would have an answer. He always had an answer. But what Absalom did not know was that Hushai was listening, that David's spy was in the room, that the counsel given would be reported to the priests and sent by their sons to the king in exile. The game was not yet over, and the next move would determine everything. Ahithophel understood exactly what needed to happen. He had not become David's most trusted advisor by being cautious or sentimental. He understood warfare, understood psychology, understood that in a rebellion, momentum was everything. And right now, momentum belonged to Absalom. The key was to act before that momentum shifted, before David had time to think or plan or gather his strength. "Let me choose 12,000 men," Ahithophel said to Absalom, "and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." It was brilliant strategy, the kind of counsel that had made Ahithophel's reputation. Strike immediately tonight while David's forces were exhausted from their flight, while they were disorganized and demoralized, while they had not yet established defensive positions or developed a plan. 12,000 men were enough to overwhelm David's bodyguard, but not so many, that organizing them would take significant time. Move fast, hit hard, kill David specifically, and then offer everyone else mercy and a return to normal life. The beauty of the plan was that it minimized bloodshed while maximizing effectiveness. This was not about destroying an army, but about eliminating one man. Once David was dead, the rebellion would collapse. His followers would have no one to follow. The tribes that had stayed loyal would have no king to be loyal to. Absalom could present himself as a unifier rather than a conqueror, someone who had removed the obstacle to peace rather than someone who had torn the nation apart. And the timing was perfect. David was somewhere east of Jerusalem, probably not far yet, still trying to organize his refugees into something resembling a fighting force. He would not expect an immediate attack. He would assume Absalom needed time to consolidate control of Jerusalem, time to gather forces, time to plan. A night strike would catch him completely off guard, and Ahithophel was right that the psychological impact would be devastating. David's people were already frightened and uncertain. A sudden attack in the darkness would turn fear into panic, and in panic people ran rather than fought. The advice pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel. They could see the logic, could understand why this was the right move. But Absalom made a decision that would change everything. Then Absalom said, "Call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he has to say." Why did Absalom do this? Perhaps he wanted consensus from all his counselors. Perhaps he wanted to show that he listened to multiple voices rather than relying on just one advisor. Perhaps some instinct made him want a second opinion on something so decisive. Or perhaps God was already answering David's prayer, already working to turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness by putting the thought into Absalom's mind to seek another perspective. Hushai came when summoned, and Absalom explained Ahithophel's plan. "Thus has Ahithophel spoken," Absalom said. "Shall we do as he says? If not, speak up." It was Hushai's moment, the reason David had sent him back to Jerusalem. Everything depended on what he said next and whether he could make it convincing enough to override Ahithophel's obvious wisdom. Hushai had to be careful. If he opposed Ahithophel's counsel too directly or too obviously, Absalom might suspect his motives. But if he was too subtle, Absalom might follow Ahithophel's advice anyway. He needed to provide reasoning that sounded wise, that appealed to Absalom's ego and fears, that offered an alternative that seemed even better than Ahithophel's excellent plan. "This time the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good," Hushai said. He started with a direct contradiction, establishing that he was offering a completely different perspective. Then he began to build his case, focusing not on strategy but on psychology, painting a picture designed to frighten Absalom. "You know that your father and his men are mighty men," Hushai continued, "and that they are enraged, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits or in some other place." Hushai was playing on what everyone knew about David. He was the giant killer, the warrior who had never lost, the man who had built this kingdom through military genius. Even in flight, even exhausted and demoralized, David was dangerous. Hushai was suggesting that sending 12,000 men tonight might not be overwhelming force, but rather walking into a trap. David would not be where Ahithophel expected him to be. He would have hidden himself, prepared an ambush, turned his weakness into strength through cunning. And as soon as some of the people fall at the first attack, Hushai went on, "Whoever hears it will say, 'There has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.' Then even the valiant man whose heart is like the heart of a lion will utterly melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and that those who are with him are valiant men." This was the key psychological move. Hushai was suggesting that even a partial failure, even casualties in the attacking force, would create a perception of defeat that would undermine everything Absalom had built. The momentum would shift. The narrative would change from Absalom's inevitable victory to David's dangerous resilience. And once people started doubting Absalom's strength, the whole coalition could unravel. "But my counsel is," Hushai said, pivoting to his alternative plan, "that all Israel be gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So we shall come upon him in some place where he is to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and all the men with him not one will be left. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we shall drag it into the valley until not even a pebble is to be found there." Hushai's alternative appealed to everything in Absalom that was prideful and grandiose. Rather than a quick strike by 12,000 gather all Israel, rather than a night raid lead a massive army personally. Rather than surgical elimination of David, total annihilation of everything and everyone associated with him. Make it not just a military operation, but a demonstration of overwhelming power, a spectacle of strength that would live in memory forever. The plan was terrible strategy. Gathering all Israel would take weeks. It would give David all the time he needed to prepare defenses, to choose favorable ground, to organize his forces. Leading personally meant Absalom would be exposed to danger, and the imagery of dragging cities into valleys was dramatic but impractical. But none of that mattered if the plan sounded good, if it appealed to Absalom's vanity and his desire to be seen as a great king rather than just a successful conspirator. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel." The text then adds the crucial explanation, for the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. This is the theological heart of the story. Ahithophel's counsel was objectively better. Any military mind could see that. Strike fast, strike now. Eliminate David before he could organize resistance. But God was working through the situation using Hushai's words, using Absalom's pride, using the circumstances to answer David's prayer. "O Lord, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." And God was doing exactly that, not by making Ahithophel give bad advice, but by making Absalom choose to ignore good advice in favor of flattering words. Ahithophel must have sat in that council meeting understanding immediately what had happened. He knew Hushai's counsel was disastrous. He knew that every day of delay gave David an advantage. He knew that his own perfect strategy had been rejected in favor of something that sounded good but would fail. And he understood something else. If Absalom followed Hushai's advice, the rebellion would fail. David would survive, would regroup, would strike back. And when David won, everyone who had supported Absalom would face consequences. The text tells us what Ahithophel did next. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself, and he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. Ahithophel committed suicide because he saw the future clearly. He was a wise man, perhaps the wisest in the kingdom, and wisdom showed him that supporting Absalom was now a fatal mistake. Rather than wait for the inevitable defeat and execution, he chose to end his own life on his own terms. His death was both an admission of failure and a statement. This cause is lost, and I will not be part of its collapse. Meanwhile, Hushai did exactly what David had instructed. He went immediately to Zadok and Abiathar the priests and reported everything that had been discussed in the council. "Tell David," Hushai urged, "do not spend the night at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means cross over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up." The priests sent their sons Ahimaaz and Jonathan with the message. These young men risked their lives running to David with news that could save him. They were spotted and pursued, but managed to hide in a well, covered by a woman who lied to the searchers to protect them. Eventually, they reached David with the crucial intelligence. Absalom had rejected Ahithophel's advice to strike immediately. David had time. He could cross the Jordan, establish defensive positions, prepare for the coming battle. That night, David and all his people crossed the Jordan River. By daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed. They moved from the area immediately around Jerusalem deeper into the wilderness, to places where David's knowledge of the terrain gave him advantages, where his smaller but more experienced force could choose when and where to fight. Absalom had made his fatal mistake. He had chosen the counsel that made him feel powerful over the counsel that would have made him victorious. He had chosen spectacle over effectiveness, flattery over truth. And that choice, orchestrated by God working through Hushai's words and Absalom's pride, had just given David the gift of time. Time to think, time to plan, time to turn refugees into an army. The momentum had shifted, though Absalom did not yet realize it. The beautiful prince was about to learn that warfare is not won by the size of your army or the grandeur of your plans, but by timing, positioning, and the will of God working through circumstances beyond any man's control. David came to Mahanaim, a fortified city east of the Jordan River in the territory of Gilead. This was not random refuge but strategic positioning. Mahanaim had history. It was where Jacob had encountered angels, where the name itself meant two camps. It was where Ishbosheth, Saul's son, had briefly ruled after Saul's death before David united the kingdom. It was a place associated with transition between old and new, with divine encounters, with the complex business of kingship in Israel. Now it would serve as David's base while he transformed his fleeing refugees into a fighting force. As David and his people arrived exhausted from their forced march, something remarkable happened. Help came from unexpected places. Shobi the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, Machir the son of Amiel from Lodebar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim brought supplies. Beds and basins and earthen vessels, wheat and barley and flour, parched grain and beans and lentils, honey and curds, and sheep and cheese from the herd. The text lists the provisions in detail because they mattered immensely. An army cannot fight on empty stomachs, and David's people had fled with almost nothing. These suppliers understood what David's forces needed. They said the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. It was both compassion and calculation. Shobi was from Ammon, a nation David had conquered and subjected. His brother Hanun had humiliated David's messengers years before, triggering a war that led to Ammon's defeat. Yet here was Shobi helping David in his moment of crisis. Perhaps he saw an opportunity to show loyalty and earn favor. Perhaps he understood that his own position depended on David remaining king. Or perhaps he simply recognized that even a conquered enemy was better than the chaos that Absalom's rule might bring. Barzillai would prove especially important. He was wealthy, aged 80 years old, and deeply loyal to David for reasons the text does not fully explain. His support was not opportunistic but heartfelt, and David would remember it. With supplies secured and time bought by Hushai's successful deception, David organized his forces. He numbered the people who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. It was the military structure he knew, the system that had won him a kingdom. These were not raw recruits but experienced warriors, many of whom had fought with David for decades. They knew battle. They knew each other. They knew their king. What they lacked in numbers compared to Absalom's swelling forces, they made up for in cohesion, experience, and leadership. David divided his army into 3 groups, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under Joab's brother Abishai the son of Zeruiah, and 1/3 under Ittai the Gittite, that Philistine warrior whose loyalty had proven absolute. This division allowed for tactical flexibility, the ability to attack from multiple directions, to reinforce weak points, to exploit opportunities. It was the kind of sophisticated military organization that marked professional armies, and it stood in stark contrast to Absalom's mass of volunteers who had joined the rebellion for various reasons, but who lacked the unity of purpose that comes from years of fighting together. Then David announced his intention to go out with them to battle. "I myself will also go out with you," he told his commanders and his troops. It was what warriors expected from their king. David had never been the kind of ruler who sent others to fight while he remained safe behind walls. He was a warrior king who led from the front, whose courage in battle was legendary, who asked nothing of his men that he was not willing to do himself. But the people refused to let him go. "You shall not go out," they said, "for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city." Their reasoning was both tactical and emotional. Tactically, if David fell in battle, the cause was lost. Everything depended on him. His death would end the war immediately in Absalom's favor. No other leader could hold these forces together, could command the loyalty that David commanded, could provide the legitimacy that David represented. David was not just another soldier. He was the reason for fighting, the symbol of what they were defending. Losing him would mean losing everything. Emotionally, they were also protecting their king from having to fight his own son. David would go into battle if ordered, would face Absalom's forces without hesitation. But how could any father be expected to fight effectively while knowing his own son was somewhere on the other side, leading the enemy, potentially facing him sword to sword? The commanders understood that David's presence would be a liability rather than an asset, not because he lacked courage, but because his heart would be divided in a way that would compromise his effectiveness. David accepted their counsel. "Whatever seems best to you, I will do," he said. So he stood beside the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And then David gave the command that everyone heard, the command that would echo through the coming battle, the command that revealed where David's heart truly was. "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." He said it to Joab, to Abishai, to Ittai, loud enough that all the people heard it. This was not a private request to his commanders, but a public order witnessed by the entire army. Despite everything Absalom had done, the murder of Amnon, the conspiracy, the rebellion, the seizure of Jerusalem, the violation of David's concubines, David still called him the young man, still thought of him as a son to be protected rather than an enemy to be destroyed, still hoped somehow that this could end without Absalom's death. The army marched out to face Absalom's forces in the field. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, though Ephraim's tribal territory was west of the Jordan, and this forest was east of the river. Perhaps the name had migrated with settlers from Ephraim, or perhaps the text uses Ephraim to mean simply a forest, or perhaps there are details of geography lost to history. What matters is that the battle happened in heavily forested terrain, not in open ground where Absalom's superior numbers would have been decisive. This terrain choice was crucial. David's commanders understood warfare in difficult terrain. They knew how to use forest cover, how to set ambushes, how to turn trees and undergrowth from obstacles into advantages. Absalom's army, larger but less experienced, less disciplined, found the forest a nightmare. Formations broke apart. Units lost contact with each other. Command and control fell apart. The very size that should have been Absalom's advantage became a liability as masses of men stumbled through the trees without clear direction. The battle was fierce throughout the forest. David's 3 divisions attacked from multiple directions, hitting Absalom's disorganized forces at their weakest points, then melting back into the trees before counterattacks could form. It was not a single pitched battle, but hundreds of small engagements scattered through the woods, and in each of these encounters, experience and leadership mattered more than numbers. The text tells us that the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. That last phrase is haunting and significant. The forest devoured more people than the sword. Absalom's troops, many of them young men who had joined the rebellion with dreams of glory and change, found themselves lost in the woods. Some fell into ravines. Some were picked off by David's warriors who knew the terrain. Some simply panicked and ran, only to become more lost, more isolated, more vulnerable. The forest became a killing ground not because of its inherent danger, but because it turned Absalom's massive followers into scattered individuals, easy prey for an organized, experienced force that knew how to fight in such conditions. Absalom's overconfidence had led him here. He had gathered this massive army, believing that size equaled strength, that overwhelming numbers would guarantee victory. He had rejected Ahithophel's advice to strike fast with a small force, and had instead waited weeks to assemble his impressive host. And now that host was being destroyed, not in glorious battle, but in confused, scattered fighting throughout a forest that offered no glory, only death. The young men who had followed Absalom were learning the hard truth that enthusiasm is not the same as skill, that believing in a cause does not make you effective in combat, that real warfare is brutal and confusing and utterly unlike the heroic stories they had probably imagined. They were dying not in dramatic duels but in frightened chaos, cut down by veterans who killed efficiently and without sentiment, who had done this countless times before, who understood that survival in battle came from discipline and experience rather than passion and numbers. And somewhere in that forest, Absalom himself was riding his mule, trying to command forces that were already broken, trying to rally troops who were already fleeing, trying to make sense of a disaster that was unfolding faster than he could process. The beautiful prince who had stolen the hearts of Israel, who had promised justice and renewal, who had seemed destined for greatness, was about to discover that warfare was not theater, that real power came from competence rather than charisma, that his father's years of experience and his father's loyal commanders knew things that no amount of beauty or ambition could replace. The forest of Ephraim was teaching lessons that day, harsh lessons written in blood. And the harshest lesson of all was about to be taught to Absalom personally, in a manner so ironic, so tragically fitting, that it would be remembered and retold for thousands of years. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. He was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. That one sentence contains universes of irony and meaning. Absalom, whose beauty had been his defining characteristic, whose hair was so magnificent that when he cut it once a year it weighed 5 pounds by the royal standard, found himself trapped by that very hair, the luxurious mane that had made people stop and stare, that had been a source of pride and a symbol of his perfection, now held him helpless. Caught in the oak's branches, unable to free himself, unable to command, unable to do anything but hang there waiting for whatever would come next. The image is almost supernatural in its symbolism. Suspended between heaven and earth, the text says. Not on the ground where normal men belonged, but not in the heavens either, where he had perhaps thought his ambitions were taking him. Caught in between, belonging nowhere, neither triumphant nor able to escape, neither living freely nor dead. It was a physical manifestation of his entire position. He had tried to rise above his proper place, tried to take what belonged to his father, tried to claim kingship before its proper time. And now he hung suspended, having reached neither the height he sought nor able to return to the ground he had left. A certain man saw it and told Joab, "I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." The man had found the rebel prince completely vulnerable, the leader whose defeat would end the war, the target everyone was seeking. And he had done nothing but report it to his commander. This tells us something crucial about the discipline and loyalty of David's forces. This soldier could have killed Absalom himself, could have claimed the glory and probably a reward. But he knew the king's order. Deal gently with the young man, Absalom. David had said it publicly where everyone heard, and this soldier would not violate that command even when presented with an opportunity that might never come again. Joab's response shows a very different calculation. "Why did you not strike him there to the ground?" Joab demanded. "I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." The offer was generous. 10 pieces of silver was significant wealth. A belt from a commander was a mark of honor and distinction. Joab was making clear that killing Absalom would have been rewarded, that the king's order not to harm him was something Joab did not intend to follow. But the man stood his ground. Even if I felt on my palms the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, he said, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, For my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. This soldier understood something Joab either did not see or did not care about. David would know. Somehow David always knew what happened in his army, what his men did, what decisions were made. And if this soldier killed Absalom in violation of the king's explicit command, David's wrath would fall not just on the soldier but potentially on Joab as well. The soldier was saying, You promise me reward now, but when David finds out, you will abandon me to face his anger, alone. I will not put myself in that position, no matter what you offer me. Joab had no patience for such scruples. I will not waste time like this with you, he said. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. 3 spears, not one. This was not a clean execution, but something more vicious, more personal. Joab was making absolutely certain Absalom died, and perhaps he was also expressing his own feelings about this prince who had thrown the kingdom into civil war, who had caused the deaths of thousands, who had forced the king Joab served to flee like a criminal. Then 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. They finished what Joab had started, each of them participating in the killing so that responsibility would be shared rather than falling on Joab alone. It was calculated brutality, ensuring that Absalom was thoroughly dead, that there could be no possibility of survival or rescue. But it was also deliberate disobedience of the king's direct order. David had commanded all 3 of his generals to deal gently with Absalom, had said it publicly where the entire army heard, and Joab had violated that command because he believed it was necessary, because he thought David's mercy was misplaced, because he was willing to take the consequences of doing what he believed needed to be done. This was not the first time Joab had killed someone David wanted spared. Years before, he had killed Abner, Saul's general who was making peace with David. David had condemned the murder but had not punished Joab for it. Joab had also killed Amasa later when David tried to replace him as army commander. Joab was a man who did what he thought necessary for the kingdom's survival. And if that meant defying the king's explicit wishes, he was willing to bear that weight. Joab blew the trumpet, signaling an end to the fighting. He called back his troops from pursuing Israel. The battle was over. The objective was accomplished. Absalom was dead, and with his death the rebellion lost its center, its purpose, its reason for existing. Continuing to slaughter fleeing soldiers served no purpose now. Joab understood that once a civil war was won, the survivors needed to be reconciled rather than exterminated. Killing more of Israel's men would only make the task of reuniting the kingdom more difficult. They took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest and raised over him a very great heap of stones. This was burial without honor, the kind of grave given to criminals and blasphemers. No tomb carved in rock, no monument to mark his passing, no honored place among his fathers. Just a pit and stones, as if they were burying something shameful that needed to be covered and forgotten. The irony continued even in death. The text tells us that during his life Absalom had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, saying, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. He had been so concerned about being remembered, about leaving a legacy, about ensuring his name would continue even though his sons had apparently died young or been otherwise lost to history. He had built himself a monument in the King's Valley near Jerusalem, something grand and visible that would tell future generations that Absalom had existed, that he had mattered. But he ended up in an unmarked pit covered with stones in a forest east of the Jordan. The monument he built to himself stands in one place, but he died and was buried with dishonor in another. Even his concern about legacy, about being remembered, about having a name that endured, became part of the tragedy. He would be remembered, but not in the way he had imagined. Not as a great king or a champion of justice, but as the beautiful prince who rebelled against his father, who died caught by his own hair, who brought civil war to Israel and ended up in a pit covered with stones. All Israel who were with Absalom fled, every man to his home. The army that had seemed so impressive, so numerous, so confident just hours before simply dissolved. Without Absalom, there was no cause. Without a leader, there was no rebellion. Everyone who had joined him, who had believed in his promises, who had thought he would be a better king than David, now ran for home, hoping to distance themselves from the disaster, hoping David would be merciful, hoping they could somehow avoid the consequences of having chosen the wrong side. In the forest of Ephraim, among the trees that had devoured so many that day, Absalom's body lay in its pit, the beautiful prince, the third son, the man whose face had made people stop and stare, the rebel who had almost seized a kingdom. Dead at perhaps 30 years old, killed by the general of the father he had betrayed, buried without honor in a place far from the monument he had built to ensure his name would be remembered. His hair, that magnificent hair that had caught in the oak branches, was probably matted with blood now. His beauty was destroyed. His ambition was finished. His rebellion was ended. And somewhere to the west in Mahanaim, David waited for news of the battle, not knowing yet that he had won the war but lost his son. Not knowing yet that the victory everyone else would celebrate would break his heart in a way that no defeat ever could. The sun was setting over the forest of Ephraim. The battle was done. The survivors were fleeing or tending their wounds or beginning the grim work of counting the dead. And Absalom hung in history, suspended forever between heaven and earth in the stories people would tell for thousands of years. A warning about beauty without wisdom, ambition without patience, and the terrible cost of rebellion against those we should love most. Messengers ran to bring the news of victory. Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, one of the young priests who had served as David's spy network during the rebellion, asked Joab for permission to run to the king with the good news. "Let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies," Ahimaaz said. He was eager, perhaps naive, thinking that David would simply rejoice at news of victory. But Joab understood David in ways that Ahimaaz did not. "You are not to carry news today," Joab told him. "You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead." Joab knew what this news would do to David. He knew that in David's mind, victory that cost Absalom's life was no victory at all. He knew that telling David his son was dead was not delivering good news, but delivering devastation. So Joab sent a Cushite, a foreign servant who had no personal connection to David, no relationship that would be damaged by delivering news that would destroy the king's heart. "Go, tell the king what you have seen," Joab commanded. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran toward Mahanaim, bearing news of triumph that would feel like catastrophe. But Ahimaaz persisted. "Come what may," he begged Joab. "Let me also run after the Cushite." "Why would you run, my son?" Joab asked. "You will have no reward for the news." But Ahimaaz insisted. "Come what may, I will run." So Joab finally relented. "Run." And Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite, his youth and familiarity with the terrain giving him an advantage. David was sitting between the two gates of Mahanaim, that fortified city where he had organized his defense. The watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall and looked out, scanning the horizon for any sign of messengers or returning troops. And he saw a man running alone toward the city. The watchman called down to tell the king. "If he is alone," David said, "there is news in his mouth." A single runner meant a messenger with information, not an army in flight or an enemy attack. The runner came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another man running behind the first, and he called down again to the gate. "There is another man running alone." David's response shows where his mind was. The king said, "He also brings news." These were messengers, not soldiers fleeing in panic. That meant the battle was decided. But which way? And more importantly to David's heart, what had happened to Absalom? The watchman gave one more detail. "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." "He is a good man," David said, "and comes with good news." David knew Ahimaaz, trusted him, believed him to be a messenger who would not bring word of disaster. But David's definition of good news and everyone else's definition were about to prove tragically different. Ahimaaz arrived breathless at the gate. "All is well," he called out, then bowed before David. "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." It was victory, complete victory. The rebellion was crushed. The enemy was scattered. David's throne was secure. By any objective measure, this was indeed good news. But David asked only one question. Is it well with the young man Absalom? Even after everything Absalom had done, even after the rebellion and the betrayal and the civil war, David called him the young man. Not the rebel, not the traitor, not the enemy. The young man. My son, in other words. Is my son alive? Ahimaaz suddenly understood the danger he was in. He realized that Joab had been right to hesitate, that the news of Absalom's death was not something David would receive as part of a victory, but as a wound worse than any military defeat. And Ahimaaz, perhaps not wanting to be the one to inflict that wound, perhaps suddenly afraid of David's reaction, equivocated. When Joab sent your servant, Ahimaaz said, I saw a great tumult, but I do not know what it was. It was a lie, or at least a deliberate evasion. Ahimaaz had been there. He knew what had happened. But he was passing the burden to someone else, letting the Cushite be the bearer of the news that would break the king's heart. Turn aside and stand here, David commanded. So Ahimaaz stood aside, and the Cushite arrived. He had no relationship with David to make him hesitate, no personal stake in how the news was received. He simply reported what he had been sent to report. Good news for my lord the king, the Cushite announced. For the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. It was the same message Ahimaaz had brought: victory, triumph, divine deliverance, everything a king should want to hear. But David asked the same question he had asked Ahimaaz. Is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite, not understanding the danger in his words, answered with what he thought was appropriate sentiment. May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. It was clear enough. Absalom was dead. The Cushite was even suggesting this was a good thing, that all of David's enemies should end up as Absalom had ended. The king was deeply moved. The Hebrew phrase suggests he was shaken to his core, trembling, unable to control his physical response to the news. He went up to the chamber over the gate, that small room in the gatehouse tower where he could be alone, and as he went, he wept. And this is what he said over and over, words that would echo through the centuries. Words that would become one of the most famous expressions of paternal grief in all of literature. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. Every word was agony. Oh, my son, not the rebel or the traitor, but my son. Said once, then again, as if repetition could somehow undo reality, as if saying it enough times could bring Absalom back. Would God I had died for thee. David was saying that he would rather have died himself than lose his son, that Absalom's life was worth more to him than his own, that the victory everyone was celebrating felt like ashes because it had cost him this particular loss. The cry revealed everything about David's heart and everything about what had gone wrong. David loved his children too much to discipline them properly, too much to hold them accountable, too much to be the father they needed rather than the father his emotions wanted him to be. He had failed to punish Amnon for violating Tamar, and that failure had led to Amnon's murder. He had failed to properly address Absalom's crime, creating the resentment that fueled the rebellion. And now he mourned the son whose destruction he had helped create through his very inability to provide the structure and discipline that love should include. Word spread to the troops that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom, and the victory that day turned into mourning for all the people. They had won the battle. They had defeated the rebellion. They had secured David's throne. But their king was not celebrating with them. He was grieving for the enemy they had killed. The soldiers who had risked their lives, who had fought brilliantly, who had achieved exactly what was needed, stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. Their moment of triumph became a moment of shared sorrow because the king they loved was destroyed by grief. Joab had to intervene. He went to David in his grief chamber and spoke with brutal honesty. You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. It was harsh, but it was true. David's public grief was undermining the loyalty of men who had just saved his kingdom. Joab was forcing David to choose. Be a king or be a mourning father, but you cannot be both right now. Your people need you to acknowledge their sacrifice and their victory, not to make them feel guilty for having won. Now therefore arise, Joab commanded his king. Go out and speak encouragingly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. David obeyed. He got up and took his seat in the gate, the place where kings sat to meet with their people. When the troops heard that the king was sitting in the gate, they came before him. David performed his duty. He acknowledged their service. He began the work of reunifying the kingdom and addressing the practical matters that victory required. But his heart remained with Absalom, the beautiful son who had betrayed him, who had died caught in a tree, who was buried in a pit covered with stones somewhere in the forest of Ephraim. Israel had been divided by the rebellion, and David worked to bring the tribes back together. Some had supported Absalom enthusiastically, some had stayed loyal to David, some had tried to remain neutral. Now they all needed to find a way to be one nation again. It would take time, careful negotiation, strategic pardons, and deliberate bridge building. David would accomplish it because he was skilled at such things, because he understood people and politics, because mercy was in his nature even when it should not have been. But the personal cost remained. David returned to Jerusalem eventually, to his throne, to his palace, to the rooms where Absalom had grown up. He ruled for several more years, dealing with other challenges, other threats, other family dramas. Adonijah would later try his own grab for power, forcing David to finally name Solomon as his successor. But nothing in David's remaining years would erase the memory of that cry in Mahanaim. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom." The story of Absalom serves as a warning that echoes across millennia. Beauty without wisdom is dangerous. Charm without character is hollow. Ambition without patience leads to destruction. Grievances, even legitimate ones, can be twisted into justifications for terrible actions. And love, even parental love, can become toxic when it fails to include discipline and boundaries. Absalom's beauty had been legendary, but it had not saved him. His charisma had won hearts, but those hearts had not kept him alive. His rebellion had almost succeeded, but almost is not enough. He died caught by the hair that had been his glory. Suspended between heaven and earth, neither king nor son, neither victorious nor able to escape. A man who reached for more than his place and lost everything, including his life. And David, that great king, that warrior who had never lost a battle until he had to fight his own son, carried the weight of grief and guilt for the rest of his days. The prophet Nathan had prophesied years before that. Because David had killed Uriah and taken Bathsheba, the sword would never depart from his house. That prophecy had proven true in the most painful way possible. David's sin had borne fruit in his children's sins, and the cycle of violence and betrayal had consumed his family from within. The lesson remains for every generation. Power is fragile. Kingdoms rise and fall. Beauty fades. But the consequences of sin, the wounds we inflict on each other, the failures of love and leadership, these echo forward through time in ways we cannot control or predict. David and Absalom's story is not just ancient history. It is a mirror held up to every father and son, every family torn by conflict, every heart divided between love and justice. "O my son Absalom," the cry still echoes. And in that echo we hear the grief of all imperfect love, all failed relationships, all tragedies that might have been prevented if only someone had been wiser or kinder or braver or more clear-sighted about what love truly requires. The story ends, but the questions it raises remain. What do we owe our children? What do they owe us? When does mercy enable destruction? When does justice become cruelty? How do we love without losing ourselves in that love? How do we lead without destroying those we lead? These questions have no easy answers. But Absalom's story, preserved in Scripture for thousands of years, reminds us that ignoring these questions carries a terrible price. A price paid in blood and grief and broken relationships and kingdoms torn apart. A price that echoes in a father's cry. "Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son."